Hi, everyone. This is Carrie Cassidy from Project Camelot, and I'm here tonight with Douglas Dietrich. And Douglas is a military historian, and he's actually been on my show, but it was a really long time ago when I was on, I think it was American Freedom Radio, actually. So it's going to be really fun to have him on the show again now, and I'm going to read a short bio here. So bear with me as I kind of skim through it, and then we'll actually introduce you to Douglas, and I'm sure that he's pretty well known to most of you. So he is a naturalized American citizen, born son of a Caucasian American sailor, George Joseph Henry Dietrich, and in the Nationalist ROC, Republic of China, as reestablished on the island of Formosa, Taiwan. His father retired from the U.S. Navy after 30 years of duty covering gunboat patrol in the twilight years of warlord China, circa 1936 to 1941, a proactive phase of American belligerency in World War II, circa 1941 to 45. Sorry, here I'm getting caught up in the dates. Let me see where I can go with this. He was a Department of Defense research librarian, and all of this information is on my website, projectcamelotportal.com, if you want to read along. And for a decade, he was responsible for incinerating highly classified materials on critical historical topics such as Pearl Harbor, Roswell, Vietnam, different ethno-national holocausts, as well as documents exposing the reality behind vampires, zombies, Soviet psychic warfare, and other occult phenomena. He also is indicating here volumes of notes pertaining to Tesla, H.P. Lovecraft, L. Ron Hubbard, the Vatican, and United Nations were all destroyed, along with reams of reports detailing everything from military drug operations to CIA mind control. And he goes on about that, and we're gonna really ask him to elaborate. So that's his brief bio, and let me say that he is a very erudite scholar and a really good researcher. And whereas I will say that I don't always agree with everything that he says, I think he can back almost everything he talks about up with documentation, which is quite interesting. And in Camelot, we don't always believe documentation, but it's a lot of fun to hear from him, and he's absolutely brilliant. So let me welcome him to the show. And Douglas, it's great to have you, and it's so lovely after all this time to actually be able to do a face-to-face with you, more or less, online here. So welcome.
Oh, thank you so much. The pleasure and the honor is mine, and very glad to be reunited with you again under what are certainly far more pleasant circumstances than the stresses I was dealing with at the time that we had met in the past. There was a lot going on. My parents had more recently died, which brings us, of course, to one of the reasons my father's background was included a bit more heavily in that bio than might be usual, was because this weekend was my late and sainted father's birthday. It was on the 23rd of October, and of course it was being born the son of American serviceman that it made me a naturalized citizen of the United States. I was, of course, born within a missionary hospital on the island of Formosa, or Taiwan, as it's known. So unlike John McCain, who was born on a military base in Panama, I could never run for president, which is probably just as well for everyone involved. But in terms of what we have with what I grew up as familiar with, obviously I was the son of someone who retired very quickly after I was born, but was still heavily exposed to military culture, because as a career serviceman, he had lifetime access to open military bases. So he moved to San Francisco so that we could use the Presidio military base, Post Exchange, the PX, the commissary, as it's called, their version of a supermarket, or their version of a Costco, a kind of warehouse kind of shopping center. And we could use the theater facilities to watch movies, that were 2 or 3 months late, but much cheaper to watch. Just a very bizarre military kind of culture that I grew up with. And then, of course, I wound up working there. And that was because I had a military dependence ID card, which was, of course, maintained until, in my case, it was around the age of 21. And that meant that I had access to all parts of the base, other than theoretically closed off or secured areas, of which there were very few at the Presidio military base per se. And ultimately, for all intents and purposes, I had access to them as well, because of the kind of corruption and incompetence that's just endemic throughout the military. And that's one thing I absolutely cannot overemphasize. We do probably have a lot of people that I'm sure you speak to who tend to try and present the military as somehow being almost, how would I say it, omniscient, almost a kind of organization that plans ahead, and therefore there's some modicum of control over the destiny of its personnel. But a lot of that is quite fallacious. The military is it's a miracle anything gets done. But certainly, other than emphasizing that, because it's very important to do so, because that's how I saw a lot of things I wasn't supposed to see. I will reemphasize once again what I emphasized the first time that we met so many years ago, which at this point, the last time we spoke was probably around 2012, 2013 on the Rebecca Jernigan show. And at that time, of course, you might still have been on Revolution Radio, where I'm still at. And certainly what we were speaking about was the undersea imperium of Mu as understood within the Japanese cultural context, how this, to an extent, impacted American strategy during the Second World War. What we can certainly speak of today is a lot more about the geopolitics going on concerning Syria, Iran, and why I think it's important for people not necessarily to be worried about immediate war in those areas, but I can give them other reasons for concern concerning Michael Aquino and his kinds of activities that he has been focusing on over the past several decades, and how these quite likely have something to do with the death of Max Spears. And certainly what happened to him cannot be taken out of context of world politics, certainly the occult politics of our times.
Very good. Yeah, absolutely. And of course, that's one of the reasons I have you on the show today. And I'm so glad that we were able to get in contact. And what I will do, just to tell you for your end, is my camera, I will be flipping on and off at your end. So don't be concerned. The people are still seeing you, and on occasion they'll see me, as how it works on these broadcasts. So don't worry about that. So I thank you for the introduction. That's lovely. What I'd like to do, just very briefly, is go over your time at the Presidio. I know that that's probably been covered in so many different radio shows at this point, because I know you're a very illustrious guest. And yet, of course, we always have the new people that are going to watch this on YouTube when it's done, and who may be here with us tonight that will not know exactly what you are known for, where you really started out. And so if you could cover maybe a brief history of your time at the Presidio, doing the job you were doing there, and then any other sort of related facts in terms of your bio, before we get into sort of the overview of the world and also the Max Spears story. That way people have context for you and why you might actually know what you're talking about.
Thank you. I very much appreciate that. Honestly, Carrie Lynn Casti has done all of the alternative information media community enormous service with Project Camelot, and she's been through an enormous amount of challenges. And I consider it at this point in history an optimum time for us to be working together, because this is actually a critical time in history. It's a crisis point. In a sense, Max's death is almost an omen in that regard, and certainly kind of a warning. So when I speak about the Presidio, I'll probably take us into some areas of even the politics of Revolution Radio to an extent. Not that I'm speaking about what's going on within Revolution Radio per se, but what happened to some of its personnel or some of its volunteers who ventured too close to the fire when it concerned my background. And one of those was Michael Hemmingson, who also died as Max Spears died, a very mysterious and suspect death. He was a former host on Revolution Radio whose program was entitled The Art of Dreaming. And so what happened in the case of the Presidio military base and my involvement with Aquino, it's very important to emphasize to our listeners that I was involved with Michael Aquino as a liaison under orders. He was my liaison in terms of I was responsible for basically tending to secretarial work for him to an extent, acting as almost a kind of telephonic receptionist to an extent, taking messages, running communiques between himself and other departments. So in that sense, I was an interdepartmental exchange officer, if you will. Now, it's very important to remember that I was a civilian at the time. The Department of Defense is a civilian organization. Michael Aquino was, of course, in the military. One of the things that's important to emphasize is that I was ultimately selected by him to be his liaison because I was apparently altered to a great extent, something we had not gone into before because we were covering many other aspects of my background. We can go into it to an extent tonight if you have any questions about it, but in general, what happened was that there was a crash in the blood market. Now, there's all kinds of international politics behind that. As a matter of fact, I'll go a bit into that now because it covers some of what's been happening in Southwest Asia historically that leads up to the crisis point where we're at now. If you ever feel that we're taking too much time on something, don't be afraid to interrupt and let me know that we've got time limits, and I'll be happy to wind up a subject. But basically, during the 1980s, blood in the United States was a very different affair when people were donating plasma. Blood banks used to take donations from prostitutes and drug abusers. And prostitutes and drug abusers used to be given like about the equivalent of about $20 in a donut so that they could rebuild their blood sugar levels after donating about a pint of blood. And because of that, the blood market became saturated with all kinds of diseases, some of which were becoming increasingly deadly, like AIDS, which was beginning to manifest on the street scene amongst drug abusers and amongst prostitutes. Then what happened was that we had other situations that were ongoing at the time where certain cynical politicians like Bill Clinton, and by the way, I can go on for hours about how lousy Republicans are, and will happily do so at any time. In this case, what we had was a Democratic politician who at that time was governor of the state of Arkansas. And what he did was he was getting blood drives to get himself known as a kind of philanthropist. As a governor, he was holding blood drives in the state prison system. Now, of course, people in prison, especially men, which dominate the prison society, about 98% of inmates in our prisons are male. They're all screwing each other, basically, to put it bluntly. They're all doing drugs. The diseases running through these prisons are rampant, and he was getting enormous amounts of blood from out of these prisoners in exchange for prison privileges, access to cigarette machines, the vending machines, stuff like that. Just insane little like exchanges. The end result was, of course, it became a given that at some point the blood market was going to crash, and that would be as soon as wealthy people had children who started to die, and that eventually happened. So when wealthy people had children who were taking blood transfusions due to accidents, diseases, whatever, and they started to die of AIDS and get infected with chlamydia and various other kinds of horrific diseases. The blood market began to crash worldwide. At that point, Hillary Clinton, who was, of course, an attorney who was married to William Jefferson Clinton, the governor of Arkansas, called her sorority sisters. Now, I can't remember exactly which university she attended in England. I always thought it was Oxford, but it was one of these very storied universities, an illustrious educational body in England. And her sorority sisters were some of the most powerful women in the Muslim world. One of them was Tansu Çiller, who became the prime minister of Turkey. Tansu Çiller was so butch, she made her husband take her last name when she became prime minister of Turkey. And this was in a Muslim nation, no less. Her other sorority sister was Benazir Bhutto, who always referred to herself as a spoiled Muslim princess. And she was the princess of Pakistan. And at that time, Pakistan was ruled by a royal family. They were not ruled by a military junta. Musharraf had not yet taken over the country, but he would as a result of what Benazir Bhutto did. And what happened was that when the blood market crashed, Hillary Clinton called up Benazir Bhutto in a deal that became known as Bloodgate. And what happened was she informed her former sorority sister that the blood market's about to crash and you can make a big killing selling pure blood. And so what Benazir Bhutto did was she approached her general staff and said, you know, we've had multiple wars with India that have almost gone nuclear. Just to put this into context for our listeners, our viewers, the largest tank battles in the world after World War II took place between India and Pakistan. This is how large those wars were. And they literally did almost go nuclear multiple times. So what happened was her generals were very beholden to her as the royal family heir. And when she said, we're going to need to save up a bunch of blood for the next conflict, we need all our soldiers to donate blood, they thought that this was a sensible idea and certainly agreed to it. She gave secret orders to her corpsmen, the medical corpsmen, to strap the soldiers down when they entered the blood donation centers and drain them dry, which is exactly what happened. The corpsmen strapped down 20,000 men, basically shipped the bodies out the other end of these buildings so that nobody could see what was happening as they kept entering the buildings. They just thought the guys were falling out the other end. Well, they were falling out the other end dead and completely drained of blood. So when the medics strapped them down, instead of taking 1 pint, the medics took 12. And she killed 20,000 of her own troops. And she made a killing on the blood market because all these men had been tested for AIDS, syphilis, every sexual disease imaginable when they entered the military. So she was able to present to the world military-grade, pure blood and made herself millions and millions of dollars overnight. And everyone was too desperate to ask how she got it. Of course, she had to leave Pakistan immediately. She took off to England, where she spent the next 20 years in exile from her own country. And that's when the military junta took over for obvious reasons. And so when Hillary Clinton was running for president later on, 8 years ago, she was so convinced she was going to win, she called up her sorority sister Benazir Bhutto and told her she could go back to Pakistan safely and she could run that while Hillary was president of the United States. Now, of course, she didn't win. Barack Hussein Obama apparently had been president-elect, had been chosen by the elites to become president. And she was not on the inside track. And it was too late for Benazir Bhutto anyway, because the moment she went to Pakistan, I told everybody on air, I said, that woman's going to die as soon as she gets off the plane. And of course, as soon as she got off the plane, a man with a suicide bomb strapped around his waist and on his back threw himself at the base of the plane, blew himself up. That killed what must have been scores of people. The number of injuries was in the hundreds, as I understand it, but Benazir Bhutto escaped. She got into an armored car, started parading down towards her old home, the palace, and another man threw himself underneath her armored car, blew up his suicide backpack, and she died the way a United States serviceman dies in Iraq. The majority of United States servicemen in Iraq die of improvised explosive devices causing TBIs or traumatic brain injuries. They basically bash their head against the armored roof of the Humvee and crack their skull open and basically hemorrhage and die. That's how she died. Was she had no helmet, of course, and she bashed her head up against an armored car roof. And basically died of a very violent concussion.
Now I'm going to slow you down just a second here, and I'm very interested to how this relates to it sounded like this relates somehow to your own background, and I'm sure you're going to go full circle here, but I wanted to pause you for a minute just to a couple things. One is somebody in the chat thinks that they can contradict you and say that they were not sorority sisters, Hillary and Benazir Bhutto, but that they didn't meet until a certain year. Can you augment what you just said to answer that person in the chat? And the other thing is, I have something else to say after that, so I want to tell you what we knew about Hillary back in those days, right around the time of Benazir Bhutto's assassination. So, because I think it will interest you and relate greatly. So, can you answer that person while we're just right here?
Yeah, I could tell them that what I was getting was out of the Department of Defense records concerning CENTO. CENTO was the Central Treaty Organization. There was another organization that was called CETO, which is the Southeast Asian Treaty Organization. Both these treaty organizations no longer exist. They were the Central Asian and the Southeast Asian version of NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, to which my liaison in terms of responsibilities, Michael Aquino, was a part of. He was on second mid to NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which he took great advantage of in the most personally exploitive sense. Now, which it directly affected Max Spears. So the reason I know that they were sorority sisters was that this was according to DOD documents. So whoever's saying what they're saying is contradicting Department of Defense documents. That doesn't mean the Department of Defense documents, of course, are necessarily correct. There's plenty of misentry of data in Department of Defense documents. There's plenty of misentry of data in any documentation you deal with. But in terms of the CENTO, the reason that was an interest to the Department of Defense, the background of Hillary Clinton, was because ultimately the fall of the Shah of Iran led to the collapse of CENTO. And with the fall of the Shah of Iran and the establishment of the mulacracy, of course, then these two women, the most powerful woman in the Muslim world, Tansu Çiller, the Prime Minister of Turkey, and Benazir Bhutto, the spoiled Muslim princess who was running Pakistan, were basically the foundations of American defense in Central Asia. So that was why they were keeping track of that.
Related to this, let me say that, of course, we got information all those years ago, and I forget how many years ago that was. Perhaps you know what year Benazir Bhutto was assassinated, because that will tell us. Do you know the year?
Oh, well, it's easy enough to find out. It was whatever year that Hillary Clinton was running against Barack Hussein Obama. So we can look that up as to when he became president. That was like 8 years ago. So it's this year minus 8
years ago. That sounds about right. Let me tell you that we had a meeting with Dan Burish, and I've often mentioned this, and we put it on our website, but I'll tell you now that we were told that actually she knew she wasn't going to win. She was actually told that she wasn't going to win that year because she was told she was going to run this year in 2016, and this year she would win. That they had decided to give it to Obama, and that she had to step aside. She did get, certain compensation for that, and was also, there were a number of other things we were told along the same lines. I can say that if Benazir Bhutto was told by her that it was going to be all right, that was perhaps in association with something else that was going on in Pakistan at the time, and or a certain bravado, or even a certain intentional deception going on behind the scenes. So it gets a bit more convoluted, but I can tell you that it was also something that Hillary was shown in, I believe, what is called the Yellow Book, behind the scenes in Black projects. So just wanted to say that about that. Just, it's a small detail about what Hillary knew and when she knew it, of course. But just wanted to augment that.
Oh, I think that's entirely conceivable. All of that is entirely conceivable, and certainly I've no argument against that per se. There's nothing in particular that I would argue with there. In terms of how it impacted myself personally, the crash of the blood market, the politics behind it are important because they deal with Southwest Asia, where much of the crisis we're dealing with today is still in development. It's always one of those crisis points of conflict in the world. But at that point in time, it directly impacted myself because I had suffered a bleeding duodenal ulcer. I was about, when she was going through all of that, of course, about 8 years ago and running for president, that was a long time after the crash of the blood market. As I said, Benazir Bhutto had been in exile in London for some time, approximately 2 decades, approximately 20 years or so. And in terms of when she went to London after doing what she did with the mass murder of her own troops, that was at a time when I was about 14 years of age. It was approximately that time because she hadn't stepped into, quote unquote, rescue the blood market yet. So at that period of time, the blood market was known to have crashed. Blood supplies all over the world were known to be tainted and extremely dangerous. And so the military doctors at Letterman Army Medical Center told my parents when I suffered a bleeding duodenal ulcer that I was going to die. And at that period in time, it's very important to remember at all periods of time, American military medical doctors, American military MDs, they do not swear to uphold the Hippocratic Oath. Not that MDs in the civilian world who swear to uphold the Hippocratic Oath normally follow it either, mind you, because many of them wind up contracting with the military-industrial complex in terms of human experimentation, which was exposed during the Clinton administration with the investigation into the human radiation experiments. And that, of course, dovetailed into MK-Ultra investigations, Project Artichoke investigations, and it was found out that the entire military medical industrial complex was quite corrupt and very much in collusion with nothing less than mass murder of what ultimately impacted millions of Americans. So when we take into account what civilian doctors are willing to do, these are all of the illustrious universities, University of Rochester, UCSF in San Francisco, University of California, San Francisco, et cetera, then you can imagine what goes on with military doctors. They're paid in terms of their education by the military, and therefore they owe their allegiance to the military, and their primary duty is to follow military orders and objectives, which do not always coincide with the well-being of human beings, including their own troops.
Sorry, my cat is here in the background. I apologize. He's making a lot of noise while you're talking, so just go ahead.
Oh, that's fine. And in terms of Letterman Army Medical Center at the Presidio military base of San Francisco, that trained no less than a quarter of all U.S. Army doctors, fully 25% of them. And at any given time, they had human experimentation going on. There was an unholy alliance between them and the state of California. The state of California, to put this into perspective for our new listeners, has the largest prison system proportionate to its population in the world, just like the United States does. The United States, for instance, as opposed to Communist China. Communist China has millions of people in the Laogai, or the concentration camp system, of political dissidents, Falun Gong, etc. But compared to its baseline population, this is a fly speck of the population, believe it or not. The American population, on the other hand, compared to its baseline population, it has the largest prison population in the world. In the state of California, the prison system is so vast that the highest paid constabulary on planet Earth, the highest paid uniformed police agency in the world, is the California Prison Guards Union. You might have found out a bit about this when you were interviewing Mark Richards, but nevertheless, what goes on in the California Prison Guards Union is that they get all kinds of privileges, and the governor of California obeys their lobby, and they made a deal with the U.S. military so that Letterman Army Medical Center could do human experiments on prisoners in the state of California, mostly from San Quentin, Tescadero, other nearby prisons. What they were given were gubernatorial pardons of death sentences, revocation of life sentences, shortening of prison sentences, or even something as light as prison privileges, if only they would volunteer for a type of human experimentation. The type of privilege that they got was directly proportionate to the risk. of the experiment they were undergoing. Now, many of these men would sign their rights away, and they're prisoners, and they would die. And there were no repercussions because they had volunteered under the situations that they were experiencing. So at Letterman Army Medical Center, they didn't always just experiment on prisoners. Now, I knew quite well about the prisoners because they would bring them to the library where I was a DOD research librarian. And they would bring the prisoners in for reading materials. Like there were prisoners there who were fed nothing but a certain kind of diet for 6 to 9 months to see what would happen to them. And they would have to be given reading materials. So I would give them reading materials during the time they were there. They would be escorted by armed guards, the MPs or military police. They also did experiments on military dependents. I was one of them. So when I had my bleeding duodenal ulcer, they told my parents that I was going to bleed out, and they didn't have any real plasma or blood to give myself because of the blood market crash. And therefore, they had an experimental plasma that they told my parents was nanoplasma. I was 14 years of age. So we're talking about the 1980s, very early 1980s. And this was before even Anton Drexler, very shortly thereafter, published his book, Engines of Creation. In terms of what they told my parents, they said quite bluntly that every prisoner they had administered this nanoplasma to had died, but younger people were much more pliable and they were hoping I could adapt. So my parents, of course, having no other choice, said yes. I, of course, was never informed of this. When the blood transfusion was performed, I died. I was clinically dead for about what I was told was about 24 to 48 hours. Wow. And when I reanimated, I was deathly white because this was a nanoplasma that had no coloration. There was no hemoglobin. There was no red blood cells per se. So it took a very long time for my body to adapt to it. Initially, of course, my body didn't adapt to it. I died. When I reanimated, it was a change of my blood type, of all things. This was something that I had gone in with Rh negative, the O negative, the rarest blood type in the world. After that was done, I was an O positive, which is almost a universal donor to many other blood types. So I reversed polarity. But after that, I had a phenomenal recall of visual and numeric and various other kinds of details. Because I was deathly white for many years, ultimately, I had a horrible reputation amongst Asians. Asian Pacific Islanders consider white to be the color of death. Everywhere I went, I was looked on as a zombie or a vampire. It was literally someone only my mother could love within that community. But one of the other odd aspects of it was the association that it has with the whole Gene Roddenberry story. Gene Roddenberry, of course, who wrote the Star Trek franchise. He started off as a Los Angeles Police Department officer. He used to write speeches for the captain of the chief of the police of the LAPD, Los Angeles Police Department. And he ultimately walked out and resigned in protest when they became very involved with politics. The chief of the Los Angeles Police Department, who was played by Nick Nolte in a film titled Gangbusters. I always forget the chief of police's name, but it was some innocuous name like Wood or something like that. But he was to the LAPD what J. Edgar Hoover was to the FBI. He was chief of police for life till the day he died, literally. And he spoke with a very flat, atonal, monotonic affect that they based the Dragnet character on. And so to pepper up his speeches, he had an expert like Gene Roddenberry write them, and that's how Gene Roddenberry got so good at writing. And then he became involved with the CIA, and they were trying to frame the president of Indonesia. And the president of Indonesia was very pro-Japanese, very anti-American, and he was a threat to America's commercial invasion of the Pacific. And so they were trying to frame him as having sex with a Soviet stewardess. So they had a bunch of softcore porn films of lookalikes of the president of Indonesia having sex with Russian-speaking females that they were making in Los Angeles. And the director of these films was Bing Crosby. And when Gene Roddenberry was asked to write the script for these films, he said, forget it. And he walked out and started writing Star Trek. Now, he based the Starfleet headquarters in the Presidio military base of San Francisco. That's a part of the canon of the original Star Trek series, was that Starfleet Command was headquartered in San Francisco. And of course, you've got 1,500 acres in San Francisco, which is the only place it would fit, was the Presidio military base. He tried to base Starfleet on the Coast Guard, which he got a lot of documents from the Coast Guard station at the Presidio military base. And the reason he got these was he used to frequent and get information from the Presidio military base library, which was happy to work with people who made films so long as they presented a pro-military stance. I personally worked with many people who were making war movies who would come to the library and they would get permission from the US Army to access certain open files and documents so they could make war films that were supposedly pro-military. Now, some of these films didn't turn out to be pro-military at all, like Birdie. I was a personal consultant as a research librarian for the film Birdie, which was an anti-war film, very staunchly so, but most of them were pro-military.
Right.
And of course, in terms of Gene Roddenberry, after he was in retirement and the Next Generation was being filmed and he was just basically a consultant, they were trying to create a new off character to replace Spock. And in terms of the people who came up from Los Angeles to ask for information, they went to the Presidio Library, and Michael Aquino himself said, "Dietrich is my data." He said, look at him, he's deathly white, but he's got a memory like an elephant. This is thanks to certain technologies. And he says he's basically not a human being. It's pretty much what he said about me.
Okay.
And so they said, oh, that's an inspiration for a off character. And that's the character concept of Data was born. Now, of course, I've never gotten any money for this or any kind of, royalties, which pisses me off royally. But other than that, there's some amusement to be found. So we have that personally come out of the collapse of the blood market and Benazir Bhutto and her mass murder, and all of that is to an extent at least something amusing to be found of it. Now, the man responsible for this crime against humanity, concerning myself as the primary victim, was a Lieutenant Colonel Hagman, and he ultimately had his right to practice medicine stripped from him because he was found out to be experimenting on people in retirement. And this was an individual who had multi-million-dollar contracts with the Department of Defense, and he was someone who was taking medical students that he was supposed to be training in trauma surgery, and he was like conducting human experiments on them, using ketamine, a nerve blocker. He was doing full-body blood transfusions, just like he had done with myself, removing all the blood from their body and popping it back in to see if they would reanimate. He was doing things with their testicles so that they could never have an erection again. And for all of that, he just got his right to practice medicine stripped from him. At least it was a symbolic victory, but I kept track of him through my life to find out what happened to him because of what he did to me. But this is a man who obviously should be executed, or at very least, belongs the rest of his life in prison. But this is the kind of power the military has. This is some of the corruption that I'm alluding to. This doesn't mean that they're competent. It simply means they're corrupt. And the reason they get away with the crimes that they do is because Congress is very beholden to them due to the super soldier program, which brings us back to Max Spears and other victims.
Yeah, very good. Okay, great transition. And that it's probably a good time to sort of move over to that subject. And so I want to thank you for that amazing exposition of not only your background, but what is going on in the prison system in California, the relationship of the number of prisoners here in California to the population. And then, as you say, in China, and that's quite an interesting I guess you might say factoid, which does reflect an interesting twist in viewing one's government as to really who the people are running our country at this time. So, this is, I'm of the opinion that anyone who is augmented, and I can say that I don't talk much about it, but I do know that I myself have been augmented in certain ways. And I was born in a military hospital at Moffett Field, and sort of found this out rather recently over the last, say, 5 to 7 years. But I can say that any of us who have done this or have been part of this, and that includes Max Spears, has chosen this as a soul with a purpose in mind. And just like we do have whistleblowers that do some similar things in their own lives to cross over from one side, what you might say the light side, to the dark, to work in the dark side and learn, and then also be able to come back over here and report to us what they have found. This is the kind of thing that souls do in order to learn and also to serve humanity. So it's not a superficial matter, and we are none of us actually victims. I would love to hear you continue to talk about what you think, based on your background of being a librarian in the Presidio, in the Department of Defense, and if you can remind me for how many years again, and how you sort of were able to trace, in essence, what you understand to be the Super Soldier program, and then how it's affected you, etc. So go right ahead.
Yes, thank you. In terms of the number of years that I worked with the Department of Defense, it was almost a decade. It was 8 years. And very important to remember, once again, to put this into perspective for our listeners. The Department of Defense is a civilian bureaucracy. It constitutes about 100,000 people. The reason many people are able to make up stories about the military, the reason the military is able to get away with so much, is because most people in the United States have no idea about anything military at all. We do not live, despite what some people in the past, like the infamous Art Bell, used to say, Americans are a warrior culture. That's not the case at all. A warrior culture would have a warrior class or a caste of war makers, such as the caste in India, that is the warrior class, the samurai caste, the Junkers class of Prussia. America has no equivalent. It's not a warrior culture at all. It's a culture of what were originally farmers and then ultimately laborers, and they developed, quote unquote, the citizen soldier concept, and then they try and make like their quote unquote professionals. Okay, all of that is a buzzword kind of cover for the fact that there is no professional military force. So what you have are officers that are commissioned, and the enlisted men who are non-commissioned. To put this into perspective for the American public, because it's very important to do so, a non-commissioned officer or enlisted person, from private first class or private all the way up to master sergeant, they're non-commissioned, which means that theoretically, according to the Uniform Code of Military Justice, if they're not getting paid, they don't have to fight. And the officer class is commissioned. That means they have stock in the nation. They hold stock in the incorporated states of America. That means they have to go down with the ship. They have to fight until the nation no longer exists. So because of that, the commissioned officer class in the United States looks upon the non-commissioned class as garbage. They look on them as offal, dung, beneath contempt. As nothing but a bunch of mercenaries to be expended as needlessly and as uselessly as possible. And in terms of all of this, it's reflected in, because of that, no one wants to join the military. And because no one wants to join the military, because for one thing, joining the military gives you nothing of use in the civilian world. You can go into the military and they'll advertise all the engineering skills or technical skills you can learn that are applicable to get you jobs in the civilian world. It's all a lie. I mean, you go in the military, let's say you become an engineer, you're fixing tank treads for the next 10, 20 years, right? And then you retire, right? You go to an auto shop. Well, all you know how to do is fix tank treads. So you think an auto shop needs you? Of course not. I mean, there's nothing you do in the military 99% of the time that's ever applicable to the civilian world. So you're either in the military or you're out. So most people choose not to go in for obvious reasons. So because of that, functionally, no one in the United States is in the military. If you put the Department of Defense with 100,000 bureaucrats, the overwhelming majority of whom have never served in the military armed services a day in their life, who have never worn a uniform a day in their life, you've got 100,000 of the civilians. You put together the Coast Guard, which is a branch of the military, the National Guard, the reserves. You put together the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, the Marines, all together. All of that equals less than 1% of the US population. So all of the military, all of it, it's less than 1% of the US population. So the majority of the time, people can tell as many stories as they want about the military. And most Americans have no gauge on which to measure their claims against. They have no ability to discern what they're saying that's true or false. But the one thing they all expect is that the military is some competent professional body, which it most certainly is not. But on top of all of that, of course, you have what is called the super soldier program, which is why this incompetent, incredibly small amount of people gets all your money. So you've got less than 1% of the population, and there's your 1%. People talk about occupy the 1%, the 1%, that's it, that's your 1%. All the entire business of science and the entire science of business is geared towards the support of this parasitic 1%. And this parasitic 1% takes billions and billions and billions of dollars, literally trillions, that goes into black budget programs and the construction of nukes, the maintenance of nukes, just all of this incredible high technology gimmickry that the majority of it being entirely non-functional. And then and how they keep getting this money.
I mean, you know, I appreciate that, but you know what, there is a bit of a confusion, you know, because you're talking about, I guess, what is known in the public domain, and so we have to clarify that, because what I understand and what I have seen is actually it's not quite like that, but what we are actually talking about is much more hidden.
Yeah, well,
and in essence, the United States is actually militarily the leader in this side of the world, alongside Britain, and in, you know, with regard to NATO and their other partners, etc. But the United States is actually the military side of that. The purse strings are said to be held by Britain. So it is. I think it's an interesting discussion. But at the moment, you know, because of the audience you have here in Camelot, and because of what I talk about, it is important to clarify when you're talking about what's known in the public domain and what is known behind the scenes, and what really goes on behind the scenes. I have often also read that actually it may not be the military, but it may be organizations associated with the military that do employ actually huge numbers of Americans. And it is very interesting, but they're working in other aspects that are kind of related or tangential to the military and are part of the machine, but it's not quite so obvious. And this gets into, you know, software, hardware, and et cetera. And we're also talking about the developments over the last, say, well, I don't know if you're aware of the revelations that have come forward from William Tompkins, who was really instrumental in the building of some of the underground bases, and both on and off planet, and also the craft, designing the craft, etc. His book came out this year in July, called something like Selected by Extraterrestrials, which is a rather deceptive title, given the sophistication with which he deals with at least the technical side of things in his book. There's an interesting discrepancy with when he talks about the Nordic women who were parading as secretaries to the military, who were in fact Nordics, that were feeding them information and helping them to develop the secret space program, get it on its feet. And there's a whole interview that I'm going to be releasing with Mark Richards that even explains some of the modus operandi behind why the Nordics were helping the American secret space program and continue to do so, as well as the infiltration of NASA by the reptilians. And this gets back to the Nazis and paperclip and the whole thing. So, whereas I do appreciate your description of certain, and certainly not finding fault with it, I simply wanted to augment that by sort of widening the playing field a little bit here, so that we can really be dealing with a few more items of interest here, because I have to say, on the road to trying to explain why Max Spears was in essence selected to be killed. And I'm going to be fascinated to hear, how you can sort of bring all of this together. And so, I'll give you the floor again, but I just wanted to bring that to light.
Thank you. That's appreciated. In terms of the Super Soldier program, of which Max Spears was a part, the way I was exposed to the workings of it was, we have this incredibly small percentage of the population that continually gets budget allocations that are all out of proportion to any conceivable necessity. And
Sure.
the budget allocation is literally over 50% every single year of discretionary budget that the United States has goes to that military body. And of course, all of this is part of a pie chart. If you were to take a look at the pie graph of economics, the budget allocation, it's not really a pie graph. It's more pie a la mode. And pie a la mode is, of course, the big ice cream on top of the pie. And that big gloppy, gooey, shall we say, scoop or multiple scoops of black ice cream are, of course, our black budgets. And these black budgets go to these various departments affiliated with the military or intelligence. And of course, what this results in is just an enormous amount of money being thrown around, usually quite wastefully. Now, how do they keep getting this money? A lot of that is what they call the Super Soldier program, which is actually a super victim program. And the super victim program started with, of course, the military industrial complex going into full effect at the end of the American Civil War between the states. And around that time, we had an enormous use of railways in the American Civil War between the states, or the war between the Confederate States of America and the United States of America. And no major battle was able to take place without it being within 10 or 20 miles of track because of logistical necessity. As a result, the rail barons came to run the economy, and they couldn't let it stop. So when the rail barons basically influenced the election after the American war came to an end, or came to a ceasefire, then what they did was they put in a president of their own, as opposed to the one who had democratically won the election, who was Samuel Tilden. Samuel Tilden was the Ralph Nader of his day. He was a crusader against military corruption. He won the election by a landslide, and he won it by the electoral vote. So what the rail barons did was they threw out all the electoral votes and restacked the votes until he lost by a single vote. And it was an election stolen in broad daylight. All of this is public domain and open for anyone to verify on their own. And the person they inserted as their president-elect was General Rutherford B. Hayes. And he was a Union general who, after that, led the war of extermination against the Native Americans on the High Plains, so they could continue expanding the rails all the way to the Pacific. Now, from that point forward, a pirate flag was run over both the United and Confederate States of America. And that pirate flag was the military-industrial complex's flag. And the support from Congress is what enabled that military-industrial complex to keep getting all the money it ever wanted. Now, why does Congress keep voting for all this money? Well, they began to pump them with child prostitutes. They began to pump them so that they could compromise them. And the majority of these child prostitutes were boy prostitutes, what the military refers to as queer whores. And that doesn't mean that they're not dangerous. That doesn't mean that they're not capable of killing people. That doesn't mean that they don't kill people. Many of them do under orders. Many of them are tortured, broken down when they're young until they have multiple personalities. And when they're effectively dissociative identity disordered or DID'd, then what happens is that they are turned loose. And what one personality does cannot be recalled by another personality. The changes are extreme enough where when they alter from one personality to another, their eye color can change, their eyesight can change. So it's something that is frighteningly depth. It's an in-depth kind of conditioning, and only their handlers or controllers can use the trigger phrases that bring a certain personality back, so they can interrogate it and get information from it that will help them towards whatever objectives they have as handlers or controllers. Now, in the case of Max Spears, he was one of these kinds of children in Britain, as was James Casbolt / Michael Prince. And in terms of Michael Aquino, there's several ways in which I'm qualified to speak about this. Michael Aquino was, of course, as I said, my liaison under orders, who I was responsible for and responsible to. And he's an individual who has a terrible reputation based on allegations which he's never been able to disprove. He's lost every lawsuit he's ever launched against various allegations in order to, quote unquote, have his name cleared, because his involvement has just been too deep with the background of these allegations. A great example of this is, of course, when the Presidio child molestation scandal went down, and when that was exposed by myself, obviously he came to the fore as part of the center of attention, and he sued the United States Army to have his name taken off the CID suspects list, meaning CID is the acronym for Criminal Investigations Division, and of the United States Army. He sued them to get his name off the suspects list, and he lost that lawsuit. They never took his name off that suspects list.
Okay, now just let me slow you down a little bit here, and this is great. You know, I really appreciate where you're going here. Could you, because there are a lot of people listening that don't know actually who Michael Aquino is, they have no familiarity with his name, and they also probably know very little about what one might call the occult or black magic and magicians, etc. And magicians play a very important role, dark magicians and light magicians, in the military-industrial complex, contrary to what most people believe. So Michael Aquino is not simply someone who you worked with at the Presidio. If you could give him a bit of background for the people that simply don't know that much about him.
Sure, thank you for that. And that's always a challenge on where to start. Basically, Michael Aquino is someone who he basically joined the Army in about 1967 or 68. He converted to the First Church of Satan the same year, which had been established 2 years prior. The Church of Satan, as established by Anton Szandor LaVey, was established the year I was born, 1966. I was born on October 20th of 1966, and it was that year during the equinox that Anton Szandor LaVey established his original Church of Satan. One of the aspects that's important to emphasize about Anton Szandor LaVey is that wasn't his first name. His first name was Howard Stanton LaVey, I believe, and he was more like Levi. He was ethnically Jewish, and he had, of course, when he was very young, either because his father was in the military or one of his family members had some kind of military connections, was in Europe and had seen the death camps, and very shortly after the cessation of proactive hostilities on the continent of Europe. Now, so he was well aware of National Socialism and its impact on the European continent and against the Jewish peoples. And so as he grew up and he became involved with very dark magics and became involved with a kind of atheistic humanism, he took much of Ayn Rand's philosophy and he added an occult element to it. And it's very important to remember two facts about him: that he was primarily an atheistic Satanist, in which Satan or demons were tulpas, focal points of concentration on which one could basically focus their energies through in order to alter the reality around them. This is what magic is. Magic is a cheat code. It's a very similar to a WAM, or a ride-along memory, for the data matrix. The data matrix around us of all reality to a magician, spelled with a K to differentiate him from a stage magician, to a actual magical practitioner, our reality is Maya, or illusion. And that illusion can be altered by these cheat codes for the video game. And these are called spells. And so this spell casting, it alters the ride-along memory of the program, and your world becomes something different after you cast that spell. Now, here's an atheist, Anton Szandor LaVey, who believes in the power of magic to alter that reality, because to him there is no God but himself, who can recreate reality in his image. That is the ultimate kind of Anton Szandor LaVeyite magi or magus. He is someone who will believe in no God but himself. He is the ultimate God. It's his universe. And that's that ultimate form of satanic hubris on which he based his religion. Now, another aspect important to remember about him was that he was very proudly paid his taxes. He believed that all of these churches that were Christian in majority in the United States, who were getting tax exemptions, were all a bunch of hypocrites and parasites. And so he proudly paid his taxes. That was a primary difference that led to the schism between himself and Michael Aquino. Michael Aquino wasn't having any of that shit. He wanted tax exemption. So Michael Aquino established the Temple of Set. Now, aside from being recognized as an actual religion so he could get tax exemption, Michael Aquino was developing a theistic Satanism. A theistic Satanism meaning that there was a literal belief in the Antichrist and the god Satan. Now, this is something that is very important in one sense. In another sense, this is something that he had been working towards all of his life. It's very important to remember that Max Spears died 4 months prior to the news release of his death in mainstream media, while Carrie Lynn Cassidy was interviewing everyone she could affiliated with Max Spears. She, of course, was way ahead of the curve. Nobody in mass media was acknowledging the existence of Max Spears, let alone his death. Suddenly, on October 16th, is when the Daily Mail released the story of Max Spears' death. Like, this was like yesterday. And when they released that, why did they release that? Why did all of the news outlets? He was front page of Yahoo for 2 days. He was on front page of the Drudge Report for 48 hours. All of this suddenly happened on October 16th. Why? Because his death was the birthday gift to Michael Aquino. Michael Aquino was born on October 16th. That's his birthday.
Okay, that's very important. Oh,
yes.
My God. Thank you for that, because I was wondering why this day, and I talked about it in my interview with Miles Johnston just a few days ago, a week ago, whenever it was, when this actually, the 17th, the day after this happened, and because I knew that he had died, and it was exactly 3 months to the day that they released the information, and he died on the 16th. So he died on the 16th of July, and they released the information on October 16th. And now we know why they chose that date. And now this is almost an admission of guilt, though, I have to say.
Yes. And to put this in some further perspective, it's very important for people to understand the different religions that are at war. We are entering a new dark age of religious warfare. And it's very important to remember that in a dark age, there's no such thing as politics. In the last dark age, what we call the Middle Ages, the age of medievalism, the age of feudalism, there was no such thing as political parties or people jockeying for popularity or votes. A man's religion was his politics. A man lived or died by being a Muslim or a Christian. And within those worlds of Dur al-Islam, or the land of submission, a man would live or die by being a Shia or a Sunni in terms of their interpretation of Islam. A man in the Western world would die on the basis of being Catholic or Byzantine Orthodox. And later on, the Protestant Reformation came, and you had more religious wars within the world of Christianity or Christendom. Now, at that time, there was no such thing as Europe. The closest concept we had to Europe was the concept of Christendom. And as we emerged out of those Middle Ages, we still had court sorcerers. It was, of course, Mr. D, John D, who was the original 007. And he was someone who was recognized officially as the royal mage or the royal magician, the actual magic practitioner of the royal court, not just someone entertaining people with legerdemain or prestidigitation or sleight of hand, but someone who was actually conducting magic. Now, he actually saved England because he had an Irish conspirator who was always scrying through his shoestone or his showstone, a crystal ball. And through this, they were able to spot spies, quite literally. And what they were able to prove and put down in writing, they captured men who were trying to set the forests of England on fire. These were Spanish spies who, had they succeeded, would have prevented the British from being able to build ships that could have confronted the Spanish Armada. So this man single-handedly saved England through magic and his shoestone or his scrying with his Irish conman, who always wore a hat to cover the fact that both of his ears had been cut off as a punishment for his crimes. So you have these two individuals who ultimately, by the way, made a lot of money off of swindling various courts in Europe, which was part of their espionage activities. And they made a lot of money off of being spies and setting up criminal networks that were also intelligence networks. And that was one of the reasons he developed the Enochian language, was a code. It was a spy code. And that was, of course, the basis for the royal magicians of our so-called constitutional republic, like Michael Aquino. Now, he was brought into this world by a human sacrifice. That human sacrifice took place when the Americans conducted a satanic ritual to bring the Antichrist into the world. When what Michael Aquino used to explain to me about the mass fire bombings at Dresden, the destructions of civilian centers like Hiroshima and Nagasaki, all of the bombings that went on in Europe and in Asia were an enormous race between the British and the Americans for whom could get the favor of the demons that had been raised originally by the British Empire. Very important to remember, the British were run by what was called the Hellfire Club. The British, of course, originally had an empire that straddled the majority of the world, 25%, fully a quarter of all the world's landmass, 25% of all of its oceans in terms of control of its waterways and strategic choke points like Singapore and the Suez Canal. And the British basically were the first one world empire. And of course, during that period of time, they ruled India under the Raj. And India was the subcontinent of Asia in which dwelt 1 billion people. Now, what the British did was they literally crucified India. They divided it into 4 quarters using a crown of thorns known as the Great Hedge of India. The British, of course, came from these dreary little isles that were loaded with fog and cold, dank and dreary and bleak, and they became expert gardeners, being able to recycle whatever sunlight they could in such a way as to create gardens, despite the fact that they were in, for all intents and purposes, in inhospitable land. And they became expert hedge growers. Now, if anyone is unfamiliar with how dangerous a hedge can be, they know nothing of the invasion of Normandy by the Americans. The Americans ran into the Bocage country of France, what's known as hedgerow hell. To those who remember that invasion. This was after D-Day, and they lost more men in that hedgerow hell, thanks to Erwin Rommel's in-depth defense, than they ever lost at Normandy. They expended far more ammunition. They had far more psychological breakdowns in terms of hundreds of percentiles in that horrible landscape where the Germans had hollowed out all of the hedgerows and emplaced within them mortars, machine guns, snipers, and they tore the Americans to ribbons. This was Rommel's greatest military accomplishment, far more important than anything he had done in North Africa. So when Erwin Rommel had this enormous victory, even in death, It was then he was recognized as a military genius whose name would resound in history. But in terms of this bocage country, this hedgerow hell, the British developed something in India in the tropics where they took British hedgerows, and in the tropical climes they mutated. They grew 100 times their size. They became the size literally of the Great Wall of China. They established a British hedgerow across India, north to south and east to west. They divided India into 4 quarters, and they were able to prevent other parts of India from getting medicine, another part of India from getting food. They would decide who lived or died, and that way they can control and suppress rebellions. This led to massive starvations and forced deprivation of medicines and other goods that ultimately, in the end, killed 100 million people over the period of time that great hedge of India was established. When the British left, the Indians, and who could blame them, uprooted the great hedge of India, and there's no sign of it today, but it was quite real. And during its death, they affirmed the fact that its roots had fed off the blood of 100 million Indians of that horrible mutated thorn bush. Now, in terms of the deaths, they were part of a mass sacrifice of what the British in their high class worshipped as dark gods, demons that they had raised, using secret Kundalini magics that they had learned while controlling India from the dark cults, the Thuges, the ones who worshipped Kali. They brought home these dark practices to England itself, and they became the sexual pastimes, the harnessing of Kundalini magics by the British upper class. This Hellfire Club ruled the majority of the world based on demonolatry. Now, what happened was, as Michael Aquino himself explained to me, the American empire was able to usurp and steal the British demons the way the ancient Roman Empire had stolen and usurped the ancient pagan gods of classical Hellenic Greece. Classical Hellenic Greece had, of course, Aphrodite, who became the Roman Venus. It had Ares, who became the Roman Mars. It had, of course, Jove, who became the Roman Jupiter, just as the Romans were just a cultureless garrison state that stole all of the culture of far greater peoples in Greece. So too did America steal the daemons of England. And how did they do that? By feeding them more, by killing more people. They were able to destroy more people with their firebombing, civilians, men, women, children, senior citizens, infants in their cribs, crippled people in their beds, with mass firebombing that had no strategic purpose, but it did serve a purpose that was lower, which was the satiating of demons with blood that came over into American service. That's why men like Michael Aquino were so important. How important was Michael Aquino? Michael Aquino wrote the Chaplain's Handbook for all military services. If you ever take a look at all military services, they have a Chaplain's Handbook. And that Chaplain's Handbook is the same handbook for the Navy as it is for the Marine Corps, the Army, or the Air Force, or the Coast Guard. Who wrote that handbook? Michael Aquino. Michael Aquino was considered the official satanic chaplain of the U.S. military, not just the U.S. Army, the U.S. military. That meant that he was the man who was their version of a pope. So this man wrote the Chaplain's Handbook so that every Jewish, Catholic, or Protestant priest or rabbi or deacon would have to step back and stand down whenever a satanic chaplain showed up. Now, whoever disbelieves this, all they have to look at is a documentary called The Dark Side of Al-Dura. The Al-Dura is, of course, an Arab term. There's no transliteration. It's spelled A-L, and then there's a space or a dash, depending on who's translating, and then D-O-U-R-A. The Dark Side of Al-Dura opens up with, of course, Dick Cheney. And Dick Cheney is saying, we have to go to the dark side. We have to go to the dark side. And, of course, they show the U.S. Army Rangers carrying out that darkness. And they're doing so in a manner that drove one man, John Needham, a U.S. Army Ranger of great courage and integrity, to insanity. And John Needham, his surname was spelled N-E-E-D-H-A-M. John Needham witnessed something he couldn't understand. He didn't have the narrative that I had to interpret it. In company of Aquino, as long as I was, I got a theological education the wrong way. Just like when I was caring for my sick and dying parents in the last decade of their lives, I got a medical education the wrong way. So in the case of what was going on with Michael Aquino and his instruction in the dark history of this theft of Britain's daemons, the integration of them into American theology for its military, which is literally Satan's military. We were faced with someone who ultimately became a primary influencing figure in how America wages war on the ground at the squad level, at the tactical level. John Needham was witness to that. He didn't have this experience with Michael Aquino. He didn't know all of the reasons behind it. He didn't have the narrative in which to contextualize the horrors he was seeing, and he went stark raving mad. Now, he ultimately tried to expose the war crimes he was witness to. The U.S. Army Rangers would kill young men. They only wanted young men. Photos of this are in the Dark Side of Aldura. Wherever the Dark Side of Aldura is accessed on YouTube, which you can access it freely on YouTube yourself, they give a forewarning as to where those photographs are that John Needham turned into his superior commanding officers in an attempt to get his own unit prosecuted for war crimes. Of course, he was the man who paid the price, not his unit, because they were simply obeying the theological orders, the religious orders in their satanic crusade, an anti-crusade against life itself, as promoted ultimately by the theology of Michael Aquino. And so he was witness to them taking young men. They would always use rifle butts and pistol butts to crack their skulls open like an eggshell. And it had to be young men. They didn't want girls because they didn't want any of that estrogen to turn them into pussies, so to speak. They wanted only the testosterone of young men. They'd remove their brains and eat them in a satanic consecration. He has photographs of this that are in the Dark Side of Aldura. This was their satanic sacrament. And I recognized it for what it was because I, of course, have been exposed to that narrative. And in terms of himself, he had no idea what his fellow soldiers were doing or why. When he tried to expose them, get them prosecuted for war crimes, they, of course, turned on him, and his officers that he reported to tortured him practically to death. They practically beat him until his skin was red raw. And then they put him inside of a lockbox made of metal in the desert where it's over 110 degrees. So all his skin burned off and blistered. He was finally sent home skinless, blistered, a human wreck without almost none of his original skin left on him, stark raving mad from the heat and the dehydration. And when he got home, of course, his parents could do nothing for him. He had a girlfriend. And of course, she was a paramedic, a nurse. And she couldn't help him when he would get up in the middle of the night, stark naked, grab a butcher knife and try to kill her. So she finally told his parents, I can have nothing to do with them. And she left. He picked up another girlfriend. Of course, he killed her. And the judge said, this man is so insane. He's not responsible for his actions. He turned him over to the care of his parents. And one day while he was walking along the beach with his dad, he died just like that. Like somebody had turned the switch on a microchip, or pointed the bone at him with a death spell, which I've seen conducted by Michael Aquino, and I've seen it work. Now, of course, I'm immune to these sorts of affairs for very rarefied reasons that would require an explanation in and of themselves. The explanation is given on my DVD. I've presented before. We could go a bit into it if Kerry wants to go in that direction. But I have a DVD, Satan's Crusaders. People can order that for the full story. And that's at www.dddietrich.com.
Okay, that's excellent and very, very good information. And it's so nice to hear someone who can go into this sort of thing in depth and understand what they're talking about. I think there's a lot of confusion out there surrounding not only the death of Max Spiers, but of course, as you know, everything that's going on the planet. And that is one of the reasons that I wanted to have you on the show today. It's really something that we could go into for show after show because you are so well versed in all of this. I would love to hear more about how you say that you are able to because obviously people can understand that even talking about this puts one in a certain amount of a precarious place in terms of dealing with these individuals who are no doubt watching at this time. So I think what you should do in that regard is, as you said, your DVD is available, and I think that's wonderful, and I highly recommend people purchase that. But if you could briefly talk about why you are able to talk as you do, and one of the few people out there who can. And I will say that Max Spiers was attempting to do this towards the end of his life.
Yes.
And this is significant. I also, not to jump too far ahead, but I do want to address something that's out there right now on the internet about the filmmakers and various people that interviewed him. I do want to say that I was picking up on a psychic level that Max Spears was quite aware on some level of what he was involved in and what he was getting closer and closer to, and that he was in fact forcing himself. This is what I saw. Not that other people were forcing him so much as he was pushing himself, because he felt that his days were very numbered. And so he wanted to make sure to get this testimony out there as best he could. And yet towards the end, of course, he was faltering in that quest. So let's continue. Please do give a brief explanation of why you're able to talk as you do and how you are protected, etc. And then let's move on. Okay.
Certainly. I think it's important to emphasize the fact that Michael Aquino himself, of course, is someone who takes pride in the fact that he is not who people think he is, in the sense that he was born dead. He was born a blue baby. And therefore, he felt that something else had entered him that made him what he is. That was not whatever that original infant was that was supposed to emerge from the womb. His birthday is significant because he was born in October 16th of 1947, which was the very date of the Nuremberg trials. That's why I had to bring the background of Satanism up in the American military long before Michael Aquino was present. In terms of what the Americans were beginning to experiment with, they were beginning to experiment with something that Howard Phillips Lovecraft was forewarning about, what are known within the theological vernacular of the American military as anti-gods. What Howard Phillips Lovecraft was speaking about were what many Americans assume are fictitious entities. They actually have a history behind them within the occult. They are known more classically as the Kings of Edom. And these are essentially entities that were spawned in failed cosms before the creation of our universe, when the divinity created other universes that were considered imperfect or incomplete. With the creation of our universe, a universe that is teeming with the potential for life, if not life itself, that makes for the potential of a rich feeding ground for these kinds of entities. These entities were known of by Howard Phillips Lovecraft, not just because he had been the scion or the last of a senescent and dying family of Freemasons of very high degree, but because of his very early childhood conversion to Islam. He was an autodidact who was brilliant enough to start writing an astronomy column, not astrology, but astronomy, at a very young age, literally even prior to being in his teens, for his local newspaper. And he was someone who, at that period of time, learned to read a number of languages, had a conversion to Islam, and of course, that is where he ran into Al-Cthulhu. It is within the Quran that the Prophet Muhammad says that Shaitan, or Shaitan, the Satan, is Al-Cthulhu. Al-Cthulhu is the Arabic for the great abandoner, the great forsaker, he who forsakes those who follow and worship him. It is a forewarning against anyone from going in the direction of experimenting with Satan. So when it comes to Al-Cthulhu, this is an actual entity, an actual named entity, hundreds of years prior to Howard Phillips Lovecraft. It is not a conceit. It's not an invention. Just like Yog-Sothoth comes from the Arabic word, of course, for the alien in the sense of the unclean. And so what we have is a background that led to the Americans experimenting with summoning these entities that were, of course, first drawn into our cosm by the enormous amount of blood spilled in India by the British Raj. These entities were ultimately brought over to the American side by the blood spilled in the massive fire bombings and firestorms generated in the Second World War and the atomic bombings. And these entities were all part of an American conspiracy of the high-level military junta that wanted complete and total dominance over the entire world. And to add to their dominance, they needed a leader. They wanted to bring in the Antichrist. So on October 16th of 1947, they sacrificed 12 men of power, the National Socialistes, who were their greatest enemies. If you ever read Howard Phillips Lovecraft's only book that was ever published in his lifetime, he had many stories published, but not a single book other than The Shadow over Innsmouth. And within The Shadow over Innsmouth, he explicitly states that the elder sign is the only sign that can ward away the anti-gods. And this elder sign is the swastika. That was the shield, the ward that was picked up by the National Socialistes against the American anti-godliness, against their Satanism. And it was that symbol that the Americans decided to vilify and make the enemy of all mankind. And by sullying that symbol, they prevent anyone from accessing that ward against the anti-gods. Now, according to his own book, the Book of Coming Forth by Night, Michael Aquino was born, as was the Buddha, with the horrid swastika on his chest. Aleister Crowley made that claim. Now, this was supposed to be peach fuzz or baby hair that was manifesting that symbol. Now, why is that important? Isn't that antithetical or contradictory? Not at all. It gave him the innate power to confront these entities without being overwhelmed by them, because he had an innate physical ward and a shield against them. That's what gave him a high degree of occult radiation tolerance, to put it in an allegorical fashion. And I have that kind of high radiation tolerance because of an incident that had happened within Occult Chernobyl, a meltdown in a spell casting, a summoning gone wrong with many of his followers and acolytes one night. Now, in terms of himself, with his kind of natural protection, he could act with a kind of immunity or impunity that other spellcasters could not, who had to draw out the swastika within a circle as their ward against these kinds of entities, amongst other kinds of symbols. He was not subject to that and could do things others could not do, with a degree of contempt, hubris, overconfidence. Now, I, of course, wound up paying the price for that, without even being a participant in these rituals, even though he had always wanted myself as his heir to the Temple of Set. He was hoping ultimately I would replace himself. Now, what was important about his birth? The night that he was born, the National Socialistes, who had been fighting against American Satanism, the 12 men of power effed up the ritual. One of them, Martin Bormann, escaped, and therefore they had 11 men. Another, Hermann Göring, suicided, and they were left with 10 men. So the 10 men they executed created an incomplete ritual, and instead of bringing the Antichrist into the world, they brought forth the Antichrist herald, Michael Aquino. And when Michael Aquino was born, he later on took up the staff of having always been groomed all his life to become the herald of the Antichrist. And he, of course, intends to bring about the apocalypse. In this case, the zombie apocalypse, amongst other apocalypses in which he can reign supreme over, if not the living, then at least the dead. Now, in terms of what Michael Aquino was doing, he was basically absent the night I became immune. What had happened was that many of his followers had gathered together, high-level officers, and all of his followers were, of course, officers, with the officers' contempt for enlisted men. Though they tried to spread Satanism in the ranks, it was the officers that were always the initiates in the Temple of Set. And, of course, many of these officers got together one night and, in a drunken fit of hubris, tried to experiment with the summoning of a very powerful entity that was believed to be satanic in Islam, but in other cultures is believed to be angelic. This entity is Malak Tauja, or the Tausmulik, depending on which dialect or which language you're using, but it's known as the peacock angel. The peacock angel was considered an angel that was between the worlds of the heavenly and the hellish. The peacock angel is considered that manifestation of Lucifer when, in his pride, he fell from heaven and he fell to earth. He had to have a people he could relate to without destroying them, people who he could commune with, who would give him an interaction with humanity that would be such that he would not destroy them in his interactions. In other words, he needed a middle man community. And of course, this became the Yazidi peoples in Kurdistan, that region between Syria, that region between Iran and Iraq, where the nation of Kurdistan is currently trying to form, is also the major ranging zone of the Yazidi peoples. The Yazidi peoples are considered by the Iranians, who are ethnically Persian, the Turks, who are ethnically Turkic, and the Syrians and the Iraqis, who are ethnically Arabic. The Yazidi people, like the Kurdish people, are a separate ethnicity altogether, and they are considered to be entirely satanic, the people of Satan, the people of the peacock angel. These people, Michael Aquino sought to destroy. This is one of the reasons America is in Syria, in Iraq, is to support ISIS, Daesh, the Islamic State, in the genocide of the Yazidi peoples. Why? Because the black magicians, the sorcerers, hate them and despise them in their envy, because the Yazidi people have the ability to commune with Melek Tolsi, the peacock angel, without sacrificing a bit of their essence or their soul. They are immune to occult radiation. They are a peoples who are the people of the peacock angel. And the peacock angel is that element of the angelic and the fell that acts as a go-between between heaven and hell. It is terrestrial. It is a manifestation of the terrestrial angelic, an earth angel. And because the peacock angel is of enormous beauty and power and is so tempting in all its coloration, in all it has to offer in terms of wisdom and intellect, Muhammad, in his conceptualization, his cosmology, decided to demonize it. And he demonized it in the sense that the Roman Catholic Church of the West demonized the ancient pagan gods of the Norse and Germanic peoples, Woden, the god of the Black Forest, or Freya, and the Odin, these various Thor kinds of entities of the Viking peoples were demonized by the Roman Catholic Church, and Woden, the horned god of the Black Forest, became known as a satanic or a diabolic figure. They turned him into something that he was not in order to turn people away from paganism and draw them into the church. So too did Muhammad declare that the peacock angel was satanic, so that people would stay or cleave to the philosophy of Islam. So in terms of this satanic angelic figure, what happened was that these men one night summoned it so they could experiment with new weapons, silencers for automatic weapons. A silencer is usually a one-shot disposable item. You can use it for one shot and you have to throw it away. There was an experiment with the development of silencers for fully automatic weapons. And so they decided to experiment with this. They took weapons out of the armory and they experimented with using these silencers, but they wanted to do it at night when no one was around or up in the Presidio military base in general, and therefore they could do it at their leisure and basically fire at will. All of this was done illegally. All of this was done without any permission from the higher command. These themselves were officers. They were the high command. So they wanted to have fun in the dark and to experiment with their magic and their ability to use these weapons. They summoned the peacock angel so that they could see in the dark and hit their mark. And they were able to tear apart CHP, or excuse me, the resuscitation dummies for the CPR, cardiopulmonary resuscitation, the CPR dummies they took. And they took the child dummies because the adult dummies were too heavy to carry. So the child dummies were far easier to noose up on the swings at the end of the park of the Presidio playground, which was, of course, bordering the library where I worked at night destroying documents. So there were only 12 of these officers, and they needed 13 for a covenant for that particular spell. And they wrote my name into the spell because I was present. I had no knowledge of this. And when everything went wrong and went into a meltdown, I was as impacted as they were. They didn't complete the circle in their blood. their circle was broken, and on that night of the broken circle, we all became possessed. During that period of time, of course, we were all impacted in a way that manifested physically, impacted us in every sense imaginable. You first felt it physically. I was working with the incinerator. I could no longer feel the heat of the flames. Everything became a burning cold, as when I had my nanoplasma transfusion. If anyone has ever had a blood transfusion of even a pint of blood, then you know that it's frozen plasma. When it's put into your veins, it burns with the fires of hell so painfully. There's no real description for it. Your arm numbs where it's being entered. Imagine getting a total body transfusion, as I did when I was 14 years old, and your whole body feeling like that. That's how my body felt suddenly before the flames of the incinerator while I was destroying documents that night. And as we were all possessed, I went out to investigate what was happening, because I knew it was beyond the physical. I had no sense of empathy, no sense of love, no sense of identity. I would think of my parents, and there was no sense of warmth or resonance that I would normally feel for them. I had no sense of, if you could use the term, love or empathy. There was no relation to humanity. And being so untethered, I walked out to confront these men, and they turned around, and their eyes were all glowing in the dark. Now, my problem is on my DVDs, I don't describe the glow, and so most people go back to Hollywood, and they think of red eyes. It's not the case at all. This kind of possession leads to more of a luciferin effect, a kind of phosphorescent glow that occurs with jellyfish or octopi or cuttlefish in the dark ocean. Very similar to the predators, who have far more cones in their eyes where they can pick up ambient light, like a wolf or a nocturnal animal.
I understand. Okay.
And so with their eyes glowing, they noticed my eyes were glowing. And that's how we confronted the fact that we were at this point possessed. And I looked at the circle of blood that they had drawn out in their own blood. They had cut their arms to blood the ritual. It was incomplete. And I said, the circle is broken, and whatever you've summoned is out, and it's in us. And so we went into ultimately a prayer mode. I go into full details in the DVD, but we were able to ultimately, in our desperation, eject the entity, but incompletely. And I have no idea what ultimately became of the 12 men after that night, when I chased them out of the library and told all of these high officers to pack the weapons they were experimenting with, the silencers and everything, get everything out of there and get out of the library. When I literally kicked them out. After that night was over, I knew that forever I was possessed to a degree, that there would always be a part of me that was missing. I knew something was missing, a happy memory, some kind of pleasant experience, and I have so few of those from my life as it is, was gone forever, that I could never get back, and in its place was something else. But at the same time, that's become comfortable to live with, like an old leather glove, and it's what makes myself immune to magical attack. It's basically like a junkyard dog. My sleep is undisturbed in the occult sense. Any disturbances I've had with my sleep over the years, night terrors that occurred, were due to post-traumatic stress disorder from combat. They're strictly based on the experiences of war, as opposed to nightmares based on horror or visions of hell.
Okay, well, just if I can stop you there, and very moving testimony there. Thank you, Douglas. And I'm sure that I wish people would appreciate the energy that you're bringing to this, and the love that is required for you to be able to testify in this way, in such a personal and such an eloquent way about what happened to you. What I would like to say, though, is for you, if you can at this time, make the transition to Max Spears. And now we understand where you're coming from in this regard, certainly having direct experiences of your own, and being able to carry through to this time with us, and certainly as you have over the years, it's very possible that what we're really talking about is light Okay, we're talking about gradations of light, certain kinds of light, and whatever was taken from you can also be replaced with something greater, as you probably know. So let's move ahead and at this time, and can you now make the transition to, I think people certainly get the grip of what Michael Aquino is about. I do want to say there's a great deal more to be had in terms of the blood sacrifice and Gobekli Tepe, this group from Kurdistan that appears to have also been involved in a lot of the blood sacrifice in that area of the Middle East, and there are books written about this as well. So can you now make this transition for us?
Yes, and it's important to emphasize as we make the transition to Max Spears in context of what is going on in Southwest Asia, the Levantine, and what Americans call the Middle East, specifically in Syria, Iraq, Kurdistan, that whole region. The reason why Michael Aquino in particular and the army and the military that's beneath him or influenced by him want the Yazidi people dead is because that would throw the balance of all cosmic nature off. If they die, then the peacock angel, a fraction or a fragment of which possesses myself or dwells within myself, that peacock angel would have no more humanity with which to interact with the world. And therefore, it would be untethered. This would throw the environment of the cosmos off. The ecology of light and dark would be thrown off. And mankind itself would be at peril. I'll go into more detail of that in the future. I'm certain that we'll conduct other interviews as time progresses. But it's important to keep that in the back of our minds. Okay. And in terms of what Max Spears was dealing with, it's important to remember that this also was something that was occurring. He was being lured into Poland away from his family, simultaneous to the same time that Peter Moon, who for all intents and purposes is a good man, he is the man who wrote the Montauk Chronicles. As a matter of fact, his website for many years was digitalmontauk.com. And he became very fascinated with Romania, and he became very involved with Dr. David Lewis Anderson. Now, in the time that Michael Aquino was running many military affairs on the west coast of the United States, he was active with the military going back to the 70s when we had the Zodiac Killer. And the Zodiac Killer was, of course, spotted by witnesses in military camouflage whenever he was spotted. His footprints, whenever they were found, were in military-issued combat-grade boots, meaning he left literally military footprints in the ground at crime scenes, and yet no connection was ever made to the military. But Aquino always referred, of course, to his military mob, or what he controlled as the Zodiac Mafia. Now, it's important to remember that one of the men who I personally met on site the Presidio military base was a thoroughly dislikable individual, Master Sergeant of the U.S. Army Green Berets, Michael Ramirez, who ultimately died of a heroin overdose. This individual was sentenced to being treated with methadone at the Letterman Army Medical Center by a judge after he had killed his wife. Now, he had a shoebox full of memories of all these young girls, photographs, young girls he had raped and killed in Vietnam, raped anally and vaginally with a bayonet, cut off their breasts before he cut off their heads. This horrible individual was showing that to other people in the library, other veterans who were all getting off on it. I used to bodily have to prevent him from entering the children's room. And this individual, I finally questioned him at one point in my frustration. How was it that you got sentenced? Because so many veterans kill their spouses or their friends or relatives and get away with it. There had to be a witness. And he said, yeah, I killed my wife. I blew her head off in front of my nephew, Richard Ramirez, who turned out was the Night Stalker. And I said, did he ever get a hold of these shoe boxes full of memories of yours? He said, oh, yeah, he used to take them to the graveyard where he'd jack off over them all night. And this was all part of the Zodiac Mafia of Michael Aquino, all the way through to Richard Ramirez in Los Angeles. So all of this was disrupted by my exposing the child molestation scandals at the Presidio military base and the forced shutdown of the military base. And ultimately, Michael Aquino had to leave town. He ultimately moved from his home on Leavenworth Street on Russian Hill, just within walking distance from myself, to New York. Now, New York was what he referred to as the Montauk Mafia. Now, Dr. David Lewis Anderson was someone who was a big enemy of Michael Aquino's. They hated each other passionately. As a matter of fact, Michael Aquino wrote a paper decrying Project Stargate, which he claimed had wasted millions of dollars. That was, in a large part, influenced, if not headed, by Dr. David Lewis Anderson. Now, Dr. David Lewis Anderson is known for working with time travel. People can find his YouTube videos on YouTube about time travel.
Yeah, and let me just interject here that I have had dealings with him as well as with Peter Moon and interviewed Peter Moon a number of times. I've also, people will know of my Time Travel and Other Worlds conference in 2013 that was held here, that I am now basically selling the DVDs of the speakers for a very low price, something like $3 less than the cost of a latte. But excellent speakers all about time travel. David Lewis Anderson was supposed to be my honorary guest at that conference, and at the very last minute backed out because he was afraid for his life, as it happened. That's at least what I was told. Now, I just wanted to throw that in so that people know that that this is somebody that I have a history with, and who you are quite correct in your references to him. Go ahead.
Yes, and David Lewis Anderson was identified to Peter Moon by Al Bielek of the Philadelphia experiment, a survivor of the USS Eldridge, as being one of the members of the Anderson family, which dominated time travel. He said, according to Al Bielek, per Mr. Moon, Al Bielek said that it was the Anderson family that controlled time for the U.S. military. Now, as I understood it through Michael Aquino, this was done through cascade memories that were implanted into people so that they would feel that they had been regressed in age and inserted in the womb of another mother so that they would not remember their past experiences. This was part of a break in their conscious identity with whatever experience that they had, and it served to discredit them when they related those experiences, as when Al Bielek related his experience with the USS Eldridge. Now, in terms of David Lewis Anderson, he now lives where my father was born, or in area. My father was born in Rochester, New York, where, of course, Richard Dolan ultimately moved under orders from Michael Aquino. If people go to Michael Aquino's Google Plus page, and Michael Aquino has a Google Plus page, he aggressively promotes Richard Dolan. He gave Richard Dolan orders to go to Rochester, New York, so he could keep an eye on David Lewis Anderson. David Lewis Anderson moved into the abandoned Eastman Kodak Company site. Eastman Kodak, of course, was an industry for Rochester, New York. That's one of the reasons my father ran away from Rochester, New York, was the concentration camp type of environment that was run by Eastman Kodak Company. Eastman Kodak Company had an entire town, a city, that it put behind electrified barbed wire with razor wire. And of course, they had their own hospital. So injuries that occurred on site would not be reported to industrial safety standards reporters or inspectors. They had their own school. They had their own amusement park for the kids, their own daycare center. And in the middle of all of this abandoned industrial wasteland, toxic as all hell, lives in a bungalow, David Lewis Anderson, surrounded by miles of this rust belt, all by himself. And what he's doing there is he's using the power of their city-sized dynamo to generate what he needs for either temporal distortion or perhaps some form of mind control and memory cascade. So in terms of Michael Aquino moving in area of David Lewis Anderson, they used to hate each other to the point where there were literal death threats. Think of two gangsters or black rappers with death row records. one that's left coast and one that's east coast all the way, getting to the point of Tupac Shakur drive-bys. That was their relation to each other in the past. But Michael Aquino's Zodiac mob was wiped out after I had shut down the Presidio military base and weakened to such an extent he finally had to leave town and make amends as a partner at adversity with David Lewis Anderson. So those two guys are out there on the East Coast now. And Peter Moon, who became very involved with David Lewis Anderson paid for him to go to Romania, where, of course, he ultimately met his lovely wife. And he was inspired to write several books. And, of course, is very enamored of Romania and tried to get me to go there with him several times. I realize now that that would have been my Poland, exactly as what happened to my, Max Spears. And Max Spears was brought over to Poland for a reason. Max Spears, of course, was someone who was very addicted to drugs to kill his psychological pain. Max Spears and James Casbolt / Michael Prince and Christine Joanna Hart, who you may not know or might know of. She's a fellow hostess of mine at Revolution Radio. Indeed, I brought her on to Revolution Radio. Christine Joanna Hart is a victim by her own admission, as she's gone on air and on record with myself, stating that her earliest memories in life are sex with Michael Aquino. So you have this woman who is a victim of Michael Aquino by her own admission. You have, of course, Max Spears, who personally told me about his victimization by Michael Aquino, as did James Casbolt / Michael Prince, presently institutionalized as far as I know. How do I know these people so well? It's important to remember that James Casbolt / Michael Prince was, according to his former wife, Haley Mayer, whom I dated for a short period of time. He was apparently abusive to her while she was pregnant. And, of course, what is factual and undeniable is the fact that he was criminally institutionalized in a facility for the criminally insane because of revenge porn. He's the reason revenge porn laws are on the books across the Atlantic. Haley Mayer is, of course, a young lady who is a child of a fairly wealthy family, so they were able to litigate successfully against his stalking, which I can personally attest I was a victim of, in the sense that he would dump pornography or pornographic pictures of Haley Mayer taken from his relations with her onto my Facebook timelines until I blocked him, which was, of course, immediately after he had done that. Of course, during the period of time I was dating her, he was putting messages on YouTube to people interviewing myself, like Vinny Eastwood of American Freedom Radio, saying, "Why don't you ask Dietrich on air if he's effing my wife? Why don't you ask him now?" Now, all of that can be looked on with some degree of morbid amusement, but the fact is what he did was reprehensible and unconscionable, and ultimately he paid the price. Revenge porn books were put on the law. He became the first person to be subject to that law and institutionalized because of them. There's no denying he is a criminal, but one thing he also is a victim of Michael Aquino. One of the sad, more tragic or poignant aspects of his personality was that on my YouTube videos on YouTube in which I was interviewed, he would put out direct messages, open messages to Michael Aquino, asking himself to turn himself over into his care so he could act as Michael Aquino's care provider in his old age. Because Michael Aquino is the closest thing to a father figure that James Casbolt / Michael Prince has ever had. Now, during that period of time, I was with Haley Mayer for a short while. Max Spears and Sarah Rachel Adams were babysitting the child of James Casbolt / Michael Prince. Haley Mayer had enough money because of her family to hire them as care providers for the child. They would babysit the child to give Haley Mayer and myself some time together. And so we all had Thanksgiving together. We all had Christmas together. So I essentially spent the holidays with Max Spears and Sarah Rachel Adams and the former wife of James Casbolt / Michael Prince during the time that their divorce was being formalized. Before that, of course, I had met Max Spears at the first Super Soldier Summit. And of course, Carrie Cassidy herself was at a number of these Super Soldier Summits. And she's well aware of what I'm talking about. Now, at the time that I first met Max Spears, I became very aware of his drug problem. He almost died at that first Super Soldier Summit due to drug abuse. And this is not to condemn him. The reason he was on these drugs was because Max Spears had been so abused as a child. he was a man, and he was every bit the man, but he was also very much in arrested development, very much a child in many respects, especially when he would go into his altar mode, like when he almost died of drugs and went into the altar of a very young child, asking for his mother. So I was personally witness to times when Max Spears would go into altar form. And I want everyone to know that this man is in no way, shape, or form to be somehow looked at askance because of any of this. The man is to be looked on as a figure of classical Greek level tragedy. And he became the most sympathetic of all the super soldiers because he was the one who was able to find a period of happiness with Sarah Rachel Adams. So with Sarah Rachel Adams, he was able to maintain himself clean from drugs. By all accounts, she prolonged his life. He was tempted away from her company onto the continent of Europe. And at that point, many people began to feel that these were his last days because he was in an environment in which he couldn't say no. And he got into the most dangerous area of Europe, Eastern Europe. Poland is very much a frontier zone. Poland, a individual named James Arthur Yanchik, the host of Feet to the Fire, was someone who had once interviewed Max Spears. This is ironic because when I first met Max Spears and seeing the problems he was having, I meant no harm by it. I certainly came to regret it, but there was a photograph taken of him between Solaris Blue Raven and Eva Moore. Eva Moore was, of course, the wife of Bill Brockbrader. Bill Brockbrader was a quote-unquote super soldier, claimed to be a member of a covert SEAL team. And many people, of course, use his history of child molestation, which is historically a fact. He was convicted for being a child molester. He ultimately admitted to being a child molester so that he could clarify that he was not a pedophile. Very important to remember, pedophiles are someone who's under 8 or 9 that they're molesting, whereas child molesters is somebody above 8 or 9 that they're molesting.
Well, actually, let me clarify that because you know, I of course I know all of these players, and we all have different experiences with each of them. And of course, everyone will know that I interviewed Bill Brockbrader a number of times. In fact, I believe I was the first person to do so. He did turn against me, and actually, as many of these so-called super soldiers do, who are in essence programmed and do so, which is really a strange phenomenon. But nonetheless, I have to say, at least my understanding is that the woman was consensual to the young woman to having sex with him, the one he is accused of molesting or whatever you want to call it, and that actually the parents did not press charges, that those charges were brought by the military after the fact, when Bill Brockbrader actually let one of the missiles that were supposed to hit and demolish a population of, I believe, a Kurdish village, and decided to send it off course on purpose. And then he was put into, you know, the blockade or whatever you call it. And he was also psychoanalyzed for months on end, and no doubt mind controlled at that time as part of his incarceration with the military. Then when he got back to the States, he was free for a time, and then he was arrested on these charges many years after the fact. Again, this was all the doing of the military. They brought him into a prison. We investigated that as well and found out that he was not listed as a prisoner in the prison where he supposedly was. In fact, and I believe he was, because I was in touch with Eva Moore, as well as had another investigator look into this. So there was some very suspicious circumstances involving the type of things that do circulate around these super soldiers, you know, for lack of a better word or terminology to refer to them. What we're really talking about is augmented individuals who serve the military in some form or fashion. It does not always mean, you know, that they have huge muscles and all of this kind of thing. So it's important to make that distinction. But Just wanted to say that there is some confusion around Bill Brockbrader and what he really was guilty of, etc. But please do continue, and your familiarity with this, this story is really important because there's so much disinfo out there, and I think you're bringing a lot of light to the subject, and people need to understand what's going on here. I fully intend to, if at all possible, even I have an invitation out to his mother, Vanessa, to interview her. And I have repeatedly asked that this woman, Monica, come forward and tell people what really happened at her house. There are a number of reasons why she herself may be a victim of a certain kind within this whole scenario. And I don't know where you're going with everything, so I don't know what you know about all of that. But please continue.
Yes, thank you. Just to add to another sordid aspect to what happened with Bill Brockbrader, that was his cousin as well. It's important to emphasize that. And without going too much into detail that we can go into at some other time if that subject comes up again, one of the important things to emphasize about that is two things, actually. One is that you bring up these are not Rambos that are the super soldiers. As I've tried to emphasize before, these are super victims. These are usually child prostitutes. They're not meant to be Rambos. They are basically individuals who are basically pimped out by the United States military to congressmen and senators so they can compromise them. The reason that they are given such lethal skills is so they can kill these senators or congressmen if the congressmen decide to open up or go renegade or rogue from the decisions of the military junta. Basically, the United States is not a democracy. It's not a republic. It's not a constitutional entity. It's run by a military junta like any third world nation. The facade is maintained by a so-called electoral government, and it's absurd. These are men who answer directly to military demands, or women, and they're compromised by these so-called super soldiers. Now, in terms of killing such people, if they're given the orders, they kill themselves as well, which is why they're so autodestructive. They're all inherently autodestructive. It's intrinsic. They're programmed to self-destruct on every level. They don't have a choice in the matter. They're doomed from birth. They're born to die. These individuals, of course, are sent to sleep with people in power who are simply the facade, the figureheads of democracy or republicanism. And if they were to follow orders, if such orders were given, and kill the politician they were sleeping with, more than likely they would kill themselves as well, so that the politician would be discovered with an underage young male by their side in what looks like a lover's suicide. That would destroy every person in their family's chance for future politics. That's why their entire family is held in a thrall. Generations grow up in this thrall to the U.S. military, which is why all of the budget allocations go to the U.S. military. That's why they call them their super soldiers. Not because they're Rambo, but because these queer whores, as they call them, are what get them all their money. These young boys that were in Florida, there's a book about that grave of 100 boys in Florida at that young boys disciplinary school that died over a period of half a century. The book is called The White House Boys because they were all pimped out directly to the White House. And those that complained were killed and buried in a shallow grave. These are the kind of people I grew up looking at. When you speak of these people turning on you, great example is what happened just before Michael Aquino's birthday. Poor bastard named David Schurter. David Schurter is, of course, someone who wrote a book called The Rabbit Hole. Now, I've actually promoted David Schurter to the best of my ability. In a sense, I'm doing so now. David Schurter claims to be a victim of Michael Aquino. Now, the Presidio military base is just rat-holed with tunnels. It's probably one of the most tunneled areas on the face of the earth. 14 to 1,500 acres in San Francisco, one of the smallest, most congested cities in the world. And if you were to take a map of San Francisco, the peninsula, you would have like a thumb with a thumbnail, and that tiny little thumbnail would be San Francisco. The rest would be South San Francisco and Point South, and a quarter of that thumbnail would be the Presidio military base. And in that Presidio military base, you had a history of genocide, starting with the conquistadors. And they built the oldest building in San Francisco, the Presidio Military Base Officers Club. Started off as conquistadorial headquarters. And of course, that building is over 200 years old. It's as old as many a building on the East Coast. So it's got a haunted history because those tunnels, the conquistadors forced the Ohlone Native Americans to dig for gold. And they pioneered those first tunnels that were raw and bare. And they died. The entire tribe of the Ohlone peoples, an entire First Peoples nation, is buried underneath the Presidio in those tunnels in which they dug out gold for the Christian conquistadors. And then the Americans moved in and took over, and they eventually turned them into artillery tunnels so they could bombard incoming invading ships. And then, of course, the nuclear age came, and the control mechanisms for the Nike Zeus anti-ballistic missile system were installed. The anti-ballistic missiles themselves were too large for the Presidio military base, so they would launch from out of Marin County and various other points in the greater San Francisco Bay Area, but the control systems were in Presidio, and they were lead-lined, concretized, so you've got more tunnels there than you can imagine, map upon map of overlay of tunnels, like a Dungeons and Dragons dungeon crawl, level after level. Some bare and raw near the top, going all the way to the concretized and lead line at the bottom. 3 levels at least through history. In the middle would be the artillery ranges. Now, when the entire scandal of child molestation was exposed by myself, that ultimately shut the base down, which was the Western Defense Command Center. The Presidio military base was in charge of the administration for all military bases within the 17 western states of the United States and the islands of Hawaii. And it had to be shut down because of what I exposed. And during that period of time, no one at that time yet knew I was the person who was the whistleblower. And of course, because I was in charge of documents destruction, the individual, the operations manager in charge of the library functionally, who was administering it, he ordered me to burn, under orders from above, all of the maps of the tunnel systems beneath Presidio. There are no maps to the tunnels of Presidio today. But David Schurter claims he was one of hundreds of children brought beneath the tunnels. He claims he was raped repeatedly, that Michael Aquino roasted infant babies over open spits in front of his eyes and forced him to eat those babies along with Michael Aquino himself. David Schurter claims this in his book, The Rabbit Hole, and of course, it's out there for people to review. And David Schurter, of course, hates my guts and accuses me of being one of Aquino's great assistants. This is the tragedy behind David Schurter. He was probably one of hundreds of children I saw at the daycare center and other areas of Presidio. He may probably have never even been taken care of at the daycare center. He was probably one of these kids brought in from off base by officers for various abuses. And I would see kids like that all the time. It's important to remember in the 1980s, while I was exposing this scandal, the United States Army alone as a branch of service, with bases in West Germany and Okinawa and Latin America, cared in its various daycare centers at these military bases for 100,000 children a day. So within the Presidio military base alone, the CDC, or the Child Daycare Center, was capable of handling 1,000 children. And many more were brought in on an open base. The Golden Gate Bridge ran through the Presidio from outside. That had nothing to do with the Child Daycare Center. I'm certain David Schurter probably at some time saw me as liaison, acting under responsibilities and under orders with Michael Aquino, joking and smoking, looking like we were having the best of times together. And at that point, he got jealous, because he writes in his book, The Rabbit Hole, that he was Aquino's favorite butt boy. And he hates me because he thinks that he got all the lust and all the abuse, whereas I got all the love. So I'm here to tell you, David Schurter, there's no love for Michael Aquino. The man is too psychotic or sociopathic to even have the neurological chemistry to produce the emotion of love. There's no concept of affection. There's no concept of empathy. The man is so removed from humanity that you have no reason to be jealous in any way, shape, or form.
Okay. Time. Now I just have to say, I appreciate all of this. It's you know, you're so lovely and dramatic, but very honest as well. And this is, you know, this is a gift. But I want to be careful in terms of disclaimers. I want to be careful in terms of this is a public, we are actually live. We have a very large audience, in fact, a live audience. So they are watching this. And I want to say that if anyone wants to record this to back us up, to make sure that this makes it onto YouTube, I will appreciate it. But nonetheless, I do want to caution you in terms of, just on the air, to err on the side of caution, because Project Camelot wishes to continue. So, so at this moment, can we make that transition again back over to, you've done a very good job so far of really helping people understand what Max Spiers was dealing with on a larger scale. And I do want to say that we haven't actually had a chance here, and I'm not sure that it's going to be even appropriate to talk about the role of Michael Prince, who is also known as James Casbolt, in this story. However, there is a role that being played there, and I did interview the two of them together. I think I was one of the first ever in that case to interview Max Spiers, who said very little in that interview, who was very much under the thumb of Michael Prince, who was in that side of his altar. I had dealt for years with James Casbolt, who fed me information that was quite excellent, that is still printed on my website for anyone who's interested. And I think you just do a search under the name Casbolt, I believe. But at any rate, I just want to say it is written. It wasn't an interview during the years of Casbolt. There was a lot of tragedy in that background as well. And as you very clearly point out, this is the case in all of these people's sort of history. So you get a certain amount of augmentation, sometimes elaborate augmentation. We have a lot of verification as to who these people are from various angles, I have to say, things that other people maybe not party to. And so, I do appreciate everything you're bringing to the table here. Can we go over to the Poland situation with Max? And I'm also wondering if you're aware of his connection to Richard the Lionhearted and how that plays into this scenario, because I am, in case you're not, and I think it's an important part of it. But go right ahead.
Well, the important thing to emphasize with that would be, first off, let's clarify the fact that in terms of the young lady I brought up, who's a hostess at Revolution Radio, her program is The Queen of Heart. Christine Joanna Hart is, who I've mentioned, has claimed herself as a victim of Michael Aquino. So too, of course, did Max and James. All three of them are, of course, citizens of the United Kingdom. And it's very important to remember that Michael Aquino, if he encountered them while he was on secondment to NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and as a member of the World Affairs Council, which he was a part of. And so he was, of course, paid not only as a military figure, but as a diplomatic figure to go to the United Kingdom. And while he was in the United Kingdom, of course, he was establishing, this is again, verifiable and without doubt, pylons, as he called them, which were branch churches of the Temple of Set. So he was basically personalizing the Crowley legacy into his own kind of creed. And while he was doing that, many children in England came to claim him as their abuser. Now, normally, of course, any three witnesses alone would stand as testimony in a court of law. If three people say the exact same thing, then a journalist has full writ to run with the story as fact. And that's just a fact of journalism, a fact of legality. We've got three people here who claimed something of Michael Aquino that was never legally followed up upon because of his diplomatic and international security immunity. And of course, that's something that comes up again and again in his case. So in terms of Max Spiers and his abuse, The first time Max Spears was declared dead was around the time I was getting acquainted with all of these individuals. One of them, of course, was Bill Brockbrader, and that was the other point I want to make about him very quickly, was that he, of course, people decry him by saying that his involvement or allegations of child molestation is what they separate from the honor or the privilege of Navy SEAL service. Very important to remember what I brought up about Master Sergeant Michael Ramirez, who, of course, was someone who was definitively a child molester and was a member of the U.S. Army Green Berets. Very important to remember Master Sergeant Stebbins, who was the basis for the character who was the hero of Black Hawk Down. The hero of Black Hawk Down had a name change because he was based on the actual historical character, the survivor of that incident, named Master Sergeant Stebbins, who it turned out was, of course, a child molester. Now, the important thing to remember about him is that apologists for the U.S. military will say, well, he was accused of his child molestation and convicted for it after his military service. Well, he's spending the rest of his life in the brig. When Carrie Cassidy used the word blockade, she meant the term stockade. It was a very anachronistic term, an archaic term. They use the term the brig these days. He's spending his life in the brig at Fort Leavenworth. Now, what does that tell you? Since he was retired and he wound up in a military brig instead of a regular prison with all the other baby raping sons of bitches, we're talking about somebody who was under military control. He had to be under military control to be sentenced and confined to a military prison. That means all of his rape of children in the United States, not in Somalia, were conducted under military orders. Very important to remember all of this. Otherwise, he wouldn't be where he's at. And in the case, of course, of Max Spears, the first time I met him at the Super Soldier Summit, as I said, I made a joke because he was held between the arms of Eva Moore and Solaris Blue Raven. And they were basically holding him up because he was so just wiped out by some recent drug abuse. He really couldn't stand up straight at the time. And I forgot exactly what had happened. He had gone to the hospital, and because he had gone to the hospital at that first Super Soldier Summit, I made a casual joke on the Facebook timeline because I knew he had survived. I knew he had pulled out of it. And I said, is this the first casualty of the Super Soldier Summit? Now, that idiot, James Arthur Yanchik, actually took that and ran with it like a buffoon and said, Max Spears is dead. Now, to the point where another friend of mine, an African-American Muslim by the name of Abdul Karim Haq, claims he actually saw a obituary of Max Spears at around that time. So you had this strange thing going on years ago, several years ago. And then, of course, Max hooked up very shortly thereafter with Sarah Rachel Adams, and his life changed. Now, when he was lured away to Poland on the continent, he began hanging out with Stuart Swerdlow. Now, it's very important to remember, Stuart Swerdlow has put out an official letter that states that if anyone who claims he's somehow involved with the death of Max Spears, they'll be facing a lawsuit. Naturally, we're making no such direct claims. It's important to note that Christine Joanna Hart has put out a similar letter saying if anyone claims that she's in some kind of involvement or relationship with either Douglas Dietrich or Michael Aquino, they will also face a similar lawsuit. It's also very important to emphasize the fact that she differentiates me as a personality as something completely different from Michael Aquino. It's simply that she's had a history with both of us in terms of interaction, so she doesn't want people making the claim that she's actually involved with either one of us, certainly not at the present time. So in the case of Stuart Swerdlow, it's understandable that he does that, but it's also important to emphasize that in his letter, he emphasizes nothing but negative things about Max Spears's, presumably his mother, Vanessa Bates, and Sarah Rachel Adams, saying that he had a stalking girlfriend, that he had a family that wouldn't leave him alone, he wasn't allowed freedom. Yeah, they were telling him to stay clean of drugs. That was his suffocating, confining family. So once he was drawn out of that protection and was in Europe, he was already in danger. In Western Europe, Amsterdam as a great example, where my African-American Muslim friend Abdul Karim Haq is now, or just came back from, drugs are beyond easily accessible. You go to Poland and it's just like that, I mean, you could step into a hospital and get yourself all the painkillers you want just by handing over a few bucks to the corpsman or the nurse or, you know, the attendant, probably to the doctor. It's a frontier zone. James Ottajanczyk, the same guy who was running around claiming Max Spears was dead like a buffoon, had a girlfriend in Poland, and he described it as like, you never dared to park your car because it would be stolen. I mean, it was just a given. You couldn't park your car. It'd be stolen by the time you got back. So Poland is very much a wild frontier zone, and the drugs are available and they flow like water. Bringing Max Spears there was a sentence to death. For all the reasons that I brought up, the kind of pain that he was in and his need to kill that pain. He had been told by doctors in no uncertain terms back when I first met him that if he did one more drug overdose, he was going to die. So someone gave him enough drugs to overdose on, and he was dying when they were recording that interview. That was a snuff audio. We've all heard of snuff videos. That was a snuff audio, and I'm sure somebody's got the video. Now, whether Stuart Swardlow was out of that area, as he claims to be, and probably was, someone was in that area, and that was his interrogators. You have his interrogator who's quite the showman, and I've had this analyzed by two people. One of them is a young individual named Brandon Young, and another one is a young individual named John Evans. Now, John Evans is important because he's blind. John Evans has a very sensitive hearing acuity. So when he listens to audio, he catches tonality, inflections, details the rest of us don't catch. I, of course, was arguing that there was no fire. The earlier videos we had seen of Max Spears, it's summertime in Poland. It is sweltering. Both those guys were doing their interviews. Alexander, spelled Aleksander, Alexander in a more Slavic manner. Alexander and Max Spears are sitting out in practically their pajamas, you know, out in the sunlight talking. And then Max Spears at some point in one of these other interviews tries to look cool, and he's wearing his jacket indoors, and it gets so hot he has to take the jacket off. And so pride falleth before comfort. So it's obvious that it's summertime in Poland. There's no need for a roaring fire. So when you hear all this slap and the bang all against Max Spears, they're hitting him. Or they're slapping books down on the table to keep him awake because they know as soon as he falls unconscious, he's not going to get back up. He's never going to wake back up because he's dying. And they had ample opportunity to stop the interview and call 911. Obviously, no one did. This is, of course, if not outright murder, you can only call it torture. It is certainly a denial of medical care. And Max Spears is he's expressing his discomfort, he's being tired, he obviously can't keep himself together. And they're asking him, what about Michael Aquino? What about Michael Aquino? Douglas Dietrich. That's Douglas Dietrich. And then they're like saying, what about the Lord of the Rings and Tolkien? And he says, Michael Aquino, he never liked Tolkien or Lord of the Rings. You know what he means by that? He means that he hated the fact that Dr. Tolkien wrote the Lord of the Rings trilogy all in the sense of the narrative of the light, and that the forces of darkness were defeated and suppressed. That's what Michael Aquino didn't like about Tolkien. That's why Michael Aquino rewrote Tolkien's books. He published a book that's titled Morlandale by his pronunciation, which is an intentional mispronunciation of the High Elvish language of Quenya. The title of his book, Morlandle, is actually pronounced in that Elvish language as Morlindale. But he pronounces it when he's doing interviews about his book, Morlandale, because he had to take the Bible of the Tolkien mythos, the Silmarillion, and he rewrote it from the perspective of Sauron and the dark. It's essentially a lot of communiques or letters from Sauron to Melchion and the Witch King of the 9 Dark Riders. It's like taking Peter Benchley's Jaws and rewriting it from the perspective of the shark.
Okay, but okay. Well, let me slow you down here a minute because we're going from one subject kind of into this other. I know they're related. I want to get to, you know, because it's like kind of listening to you is like watching a movie, and we're getting to the place where you're saying he's being, you're seeing it as many people apparently see it. I don't see it quite like that, but I do understand how someone could, and I do understand how even possibly under the idea that he is not in control of himself, that someone should have just simply took him to a hospital at that juncture. But this is not the day he died. This interview is not connected on the day he died.
Yes.
And this is, I believe, crucial. It is also also interesting when you're talking about, he was mentioning in this last interview, he was mentioning Aquino. Now, I had a very lengthy conversation with the filmmaker, Alexander, the day, I guess, a day or two after Max died, in which Monica was there listening on the other side of the phone as well, although not talking directly to me. And he was explaining that he wanted to edit his video because he wanted it to come out the way he wanted it to come out. And then it appears, I guess he decided not to even release the video. I don't know exactly what happened.
Can't imagine why.
Okay, but I do want to say that what is the link up here between Max Spears' death and Aquino? What are you alluding to? Was this just a twist of fate in which Alexander, and it is said, let me say, that Alexander does have some background in the occult, which I did ask him about because all of this was reeking with this kind of thing anyway, at the time. And I was very distressed that no one was coming out and telling the truth about what really happened the night he died, why his body was kept overnight at the castle, not the castle, I'm sorry, at the mansion belonging to Monica. And that's a very odd state of affairs and very suspicious. And so what is going on here? Do you know anything more about this? And if you do think you know, can you also cite why you think you know this? And I appreciate you citing the person who is, I don't remember his name, who is blind, who is listening to the audio and coming up with some astute things about the crashing going on in the background, which I agree, I don't think was a fire. It was something. It could very easily have been somebody trying to get his attention, as one filmmaker is filming him to make sure he doesn't fall asleep. And even he could have asked for that to go on so that something would keep him awake. Again, I have to say, I don't know if you're aware of this, that he went to Cyprus. He was there, I guess his mother said even recently in an interview, for 2 weeks. I thought it was only a matter of days. Apparently it was 2 weeks. He went there with Monica. He traveled to to one of the important sites having to do again with Richard the Lionheart. Right. And I want to say I believe he believes he was the reincarnation of Richard Lionheart. And that's why he's drawn to go to this site. I believe that on a psychic level and a spiritual level, a return to such a site, if you are indeed the reincarnated person, is very symbolic, and that he may have done this on purpose, feeling that his days were numbered. So I do want to bring that up. I also want to say that if you look at the woman that Richard the Lionheart married at Cyprus in his life, she looks very much like Sarah.
Yes.
And these kinds of things go on. People are reincarnated together, et cetera, et cetera. I'm not sure whether Sarah's aware of this background here that I'm discussing. So what is it you know about those last days, hours of his death, and anything else attendant upon it? Now, obviously, again, let me say, if you can couch your remarks in terminology that will protect both you and I from any legal, charges or any of this sort of thing, keeping a disclaimer in mind, if you would do that as well. Thank you.
Right, of course. And also, it's important to emphasize he had a very fine Templar sword, that he gave to Ken Sendo, mutual friend of his and myself, to keep for him for a time being. And Ken Sendo kept that for him for a while and returned it to him. I don't know where that Templar sword wound up. He did have a history familially or somewhere in his background with the Templars, and that had to do, of course, with his identity with Richard the Lionhearted. I'm certain he did know that his time was probably numbered. His mother claims that he did tell her to investigate his death were it to occur. He was obviously expecting something. He knew he couldn't say no to drugs, and the drugs that were offered to him at some point by someone was a lethal dose that took him out. Now, of course, in Poland, it's very convenient for such a death to take place because it's an Eastern European country. There's no way that Western Interpol or various other law enforcement agencies can demand a proper forensics analysis. And that's very similar to what happened to the individual named Michael Hemmingson, who was a former host at Revolution Radio. And this is an important analogy to make. Michael Hemmingson was an individual who considered himself a sexual anthropologist. He was very much into writing the history of pornography. I used to be a pornographic illustrator when I was very young. I was illustrating pornography before I was of legal age to buy it. And a lot of this had to do with after my blood transfusion, I was able to retain a photographic detail visually and with great acuity, draw figures, various other backgrounds, scenery. As a result, I did a lot of illustration professionally to earn money, and which I ultimately stopped and swore never to illustrate for money ever again. After, of course, I decided I was going to expose the child pornography that was maintained on site by Gary Willard Hambright of the John O'Connell Vocational Institute, where I learned commercial illustration. He was my commercial arts instructor, and he maintained his child pornography on site because he didn't have a home. He was effectively homeless and lived in a church where he couldn't maintain his stash of porn. So he kept it on San Francisco Unified School District property, which is ultimately how I got him busted. And he was the man who was one of the managers at the child daycare center at the Presidio military base, who was ultimately federally indicted by a federal grand jury on multiple counts of child molestation. That was all part of exposing and breaking down that whole pedophile ring. But during that period of time, the reason that this is kind of important in terms of all of that visual acuity, the illustrations and everything, I got very familiar with the pornography industry. And so I was approached by Michael Hemmingson so that he could complete some of his history of pornographic book covers and illustrations he was anthologizing and compiling so they wouldn't be lost to history. So I deeply appreciated that. And then he got involved while at the time I became a Revolution Radio host with the Temple of Set. He wrote a book, or co-authored a book, with Don Webb, who is the heir to the Temple of Set, to Michael Aquino. And Don Webb, of course, has been an occultist for a very long period of time, a Satanist, a worshiper of the anti-gods, who does write books of Cthulhu, which to these people are known to exist, these anti-gods, these entities from failed cosms and dead universes. So when he began, Michael Hemmingson, for whatever reason, to try and provoke myself and Michael Aquino into a flame war that would have involved legal implications, I forewarned him he was going to die. And of course, it's important to emphasize that he was bisexual. His ardently Roman Catholic wife, Latina, left him because of that, because she had a daughter by him. And he was raising their daughter with two women who lived with him. And he would have sex with various male visitors who were also having sex with him and the two women. Now, whether or not the daughter was ever involved is open to speculation, but the wife got the daughter back, essentially abducted her, brought her down south to Mexico. But Michael Hemmingson let it be known to myself and many other people he was never, ever going to follow her south of the border to Mexico, because he knew the police would off him the moment he stepped across that border. Whether the police are as crooked as the criminals or not, even though the majority of police in Mexico are criminals in uniform, they are ardently Roman Catholic, and they do not like the likes of Michael Hemmingson. Suddenly, he wound up dead in Mexico. And of course, Mexican forensic analysis, the height of the coroner's art, I say sarcastically, declared, well, he had a heart attack at the age of about 38, at the top of the staircase,
Right.
and fell all the way to the bottom of the staircase. So by the time he hit the bottom, that's why he's got all the contusions and the stab wounds and the multiple, injuries and fractures and all that good shit, because, that's what he did when he cartwheeled multiple times. And so, of course, there's no way any police agency in North America was going to be able to contest what goes on down south of the border. So the only thing the family could do was bring the body back up for burial. That's why Max Spiers was brought to Poland, so that everything could be done in Poland by whoever did it, that ultimately resulted in a piss poor forensic analysis, and therefore no one being able to get extradited, no evidence that would be carried forth by the time the body was turned over. There were several things that couldn't be traced. It was the perfect crime. And the entire thing was that while he was dead or dying, we were getting conflicting reports that were very confusing, of course. Miles Johnston seems to have had some kind of inside line where he knew something was going on, and he was reporting that everybody keep Max Spiers in their prayers, because he was claiming that Max Spiers had been taken to a hospital to try and purge his system of drugs. Now, all of this kind of goes back to the apocalypse that Aquino wants, and because Miles Johnston was emphasizing black liquid coming out of every orifice of Max Spiers, that some people might interpret as an overdose on black tar heroin, something similar to that. Other people, of course, would claim it was black goo. And of course, that is something that has been spinning around as an urban legend. And a lot of that is the product ultimately traceable to the mind of Dr. Samuel Cohen, who was the inventor of the neutron bomb, of which Michael Aquino got his officer's graduation, so to speak, or an officer's promotion, by writing a promotional paper on the neutron bomb. And of course, this I can go into in some depth, but in the meantime, what was going on with Max Spiers was, as analyzed by the blind individual, John Evans, with the acute hearing, he does state that Alexander, the interviewer, is very theatrical, and when he's asking about such things as Michael Aquino and Tolkien, then at some point Canterbury comes up, the subject of Canterbury, and Alexander says, "Canterbury, what can't you bury?" Now, that's an interesting statement, because Max Spiers wound up getting buried at Canterbury. So there's something chillingly plotted about all of this. And for Alexander to say that, he knows English well enough to know that he's simply conducting a play on words. He understands the location site of Canterbury. For him to say, "What can't you bury?" and Max Spiers to ultimately wind up buried at Canterbury is beyond sinister. That is something that we can only speculate about. But what we do know is that a perfect crime was committed, and ultimately was suppressed. No one knew about it other than Carrie Lynn Cassidy, various people investigating alternative media sources, and then suddenly on Aquino's birthday, a media blitz occurs, and Max Spiers is on the headlines for over 48 hours on Yahoo search engine and the Drudge Report, and on every newspaper you can find in terms of e-magazines, and not a single goddamn one of them mentions his date of death. Right. Not a single one.
Yes, very good.
And so, and nor do they mention Michael Aquino. Now, why is that important? Because Max Spiers, in his interview, his fatal interrogation, says, "Aquino, someday he and I, we're going to have a showdown. We're going to have a showdown." Well, that showdown, it was going on right then and there.
Right.
And one of the last things Max Spiers was saying was, when they were asking him, basically he's dying. They're asking him, "How do you feel?" And he says, "Ashamed. I feel ashamed." That's what all these molested boys always say, is just how ashamed they are that they're the punk, that they're the bottom butt for some assailant. And it's so wrong. It's so unnecessary. That was his arrested development. That was him dying as a boy instead of a man, ashamed because he was too young and too small to fight back against some child raping son of a bitch who was twice his weight and twice his mass and height, and yet they're all somehow ashamed of something that they had no way to fight back against. And that was how he ultimately passed on. He probably never regained consciousness after saying those last words. That was the death of Max Pierce. But we're going to honor him as an adult. And what we're doing now is, of course, in a very real sense, avenging him as an adult, in the sense that we make people aware of the fact that his death needs to be questioned, investigated, and whoever is responsible ultimately needs to have some light cast upon them in terms of aspersion. Now, someone who's going to live with this the rest of their life, just in terms of questioning, is inescapably Stuart Sverdlow, because he does have a historical connection with the Church of Satan. He was very high level in Anton Szandor LaVey's First Church of Satan. Does that mean he's potentially connected to Aquino? We can only speculate. Does he deny it?
Let me thank you. And you know, this is obviously a tour de force, and there are few people out there that have quite the access to all of this at their fingertips, so to speak, as you. And so this is important, and this is so important for the rest of the world to hear the surrounding sort of in context understanding of what's going on here. And Canterbury is crucial to the story as well. Canterbury has this, you can look it up on the internet, certainly Jordan Maxwell, an expert in this sort of, looking up the etymology of language, etc. You can see that there is a huge occult history behind that name, by the way, in England, and you can look this up, everyone who's listening. So, but to bring it back, and I do want to say a couple just quick words about Michael Hemmingson, since I was one of the people profiled on his White Hats report.
Right.
I think he called it that, not to be confused by what are called the White Hats, which is a whole different organization.
He called himself former White Hat.
Yeah, former White Hat. That's correct. So he was doing what was, in essence, I thought, a very campy sort of take on the UFO and alternative community, I guess you might say.
He was harassing them.
Yes, but he was also doing, a sarcastic analysis, personality analysis, etc. And he was also using a lot of what I would call literary license to do so, caricatures, if you will. And I was one of the people, actually, he was pretty kind to me, unlike how he was to many people, including my former partner. However, there was some dark humor involved. And so I had him on my show as my guest. And I believe that show is still on Project Camelot. So if anyone's interested in hearing my interview with him before he died, you're welcome to do so. It is interesting that my shows and many of the shows on Revolution Radio were all erased when Revolution Radio was taken down. And that's unfortunately, correct. They neglected to back up all of our radio shows. However, Project Camelot, in most cases, I believe, and I can't be sure of this because I'm always looking for my old radio shows. Right. But I think a lot of them did survive because we did end up as a sort of a, to protect ourselves, we made our own copy as we went along. But that's just another of the things that goes on in alternative community, and not necessarily the fault, at least completely, of Revolution Radio, because this is what you get is a hit on that radio, sort of grouping. And this is how they actually, a year after our operation, took down our entire YouTube site. And yes, and a lot of people don't know that. They think that the hits that they see on there are accurate. They are not accurate. At least in relation to our earlier shows, which went on for a year, which were very important videos. At any rate, to get back to Michael Hemmingson, so I just wanted to put that history in there and say that we definitely felt that he was murdered, and that people are being murdered still, and Max Spears is no exception in this way. It is important that this is a murder mystery in essence, and it does involve the occult. It involves a lot of people from all different walks of life, actually, and what actually went on in Poland, we still haven't gotten to the bottom of. So that's kind of where it stands. Now, I just want to thank you very much. I think we've gone way over our normal time here. So this is an amazing tour de force on your part, and I'm sure you're exhausted. And everyone listening has been very patient. I'd love to take their questions. I'm not sure that we really can have the time or energy to do so. I do know that videos on YouTube are, people have a very short attention span. So at this time, I think I'd like to wrap this up. What I'd like to do possibly in the near future is have you back, because there are many subjects that we have been able to cover in very sort of short, and you're never superficial, but we didn't get to go into the depth. And I have many areas that I'd love to get, your take on and further discussion and so on. So we did promise to talk more about the situation in Syria. Yes. And unfortunately, this entire thing has dealt to some degree with the world situation, but not to my satisfaction.
That's right. And one thing I would suggest is, first off, I'd like to confirm the fact that I would be more than happy. It would be an honor and a pleasure, of course, whenever dealing with yourself, Carrie. But certainly I would be happy to come back to the situation in Southwest Asia, as it's known in geopolitics of the Department of Defense, what other people refer to as Syria, Iraq, the Kurdistan, that region. I'd like to go back to that region and talk about the apocalypse that Aquino is trying to summon. And now that we've contextualized Max's death within the insanity of those theological geopolitics, a kind of religious warfare, which most people are entirely unaware of. They think, of course, as the war in the Middle East as being one of a clash of civilizations or Islamist fundamentalism, when I'm bringing up aspects of the Yazidi peoples, an attempt to exterminate them in the name of a satanic theology, which most Americans don't even acknowledge as extant. Right. So within that geopolitics, the kind of apocalypse that Aquino is envisioning is something I'll happily go into the next time we speak together. We can make a note of that. I do want to take advantage of this time to remind people that I will be in Tucson on November 11th at the Kon-Tiki Restaurant and Lounge, which has been voted the best bar and restaurant, or the best bar at least, in the state of Arizona. So it is certainly a place to go and drink, though I ask people to try and refrain from the scorpion drink, at least until the third hour that I'm conducting my presentation. So I'll be conducting a presentation on Roswell and the Rising Sun. This one will involve much more of the European theater and why the National Socialist activities, or the National Socialist activities, post-ceasefire on the European continent were so important in historical context to the atrocity that took place at Roswell. And so I will be speaking to this directly pretty much throughout the night. The restaurant and bar closes at 2 in the morning. I'll probably speak from about 6, 7 p.m. till about 1 a.m. in the morning. But the first 3 hours, at least, I would ask people refrain from drinking the scorpions, which was a drink that the famous serial killer used to give to his victims in that very restaurant, that serial killer being the Pied Piper of Tucson, Mr. Schmidt. And Schmitty, whatever his name was, but people can look up the Pied Piper of Tucson. My primary sponsor does guided crime tours at the TucsonMurders.com. People can look him up, Ben Estenius, and he's sponsoring this event. And the scorpions have a combination of every kind of alcohol in them, and people usually collapse when drinking it, and they usually they require it be shared between two people. So that was his version of a date rape drug back in the day. So ask people to refrain from that for as long as possible so they can hear what I'm saying. But other than that, I'll be there that 11th, which will be a Friday night. And I will be there Saturday conducting my Saturday night firing lines from that location, live at that location, and taking questions and holding kind of a seminar. I do so wish it were possible that Carrie Cassidy and her boyfriend could meet myself there personally. It'd be wonderful to say hello to both of them. Though I'm disappointed she has a boyfriend at this time, which leaves me out of the running. But other than that, to get the details on any forward tickets, which are $20 at the door, just look up manofthesoil.com. My primary sponsor arranged a landscape architecture business or opened one with landscaping when he was, I don't know, 17 years old or something like that back in 1974. And so manofthesoil.com is where you'll find all the details, www.manofthesoil.com. And otherwise, you can find me on Tuesday and Saturday nights at Revolution Radio, a former stomping ground of Carrie Cassidy herself. And that you can find on the digital bandwidth at www.freedomslips.com, from Freedom's Lips to Your Ears. And yeah, of course, Carrie, you know, you're always welcome as a guest on my show if you ever.
Oh, I'd love to be anytime. Yeah, absolutely. That would be delightful.
Oh, fabulous, dear lady. Thank you. My executive producer might contact you soon in the future about that. And,
lovely.
And at your convenience. Other than that, dear lady, I leave the rest to you in terms of our exit for tonight.
Okay. Well, thank you for that. And I think it would be fascinating to see you do your wonderful presentation on November 11th, and encourage everyone to take advantage of that possibility. Listen, I do want to say one thing. There was one question in the chat that actually had been triggered in my own head, and I don't want you to answer it because we just don't have the time, but I want you to put it in sort of the file box for what we're going to revisit, because it's an important subject that has gotten very little coverage, I believe, out there, which has to do with the death of Judge Scalia. And that is something that is related to all of this sort of thing in my estimation, and was overlooked and ignored by a lot of the mainstream media, of course. But the links to pedophilia and the whole system in Washington and the Old Boys Network, et cetera, and what went on with the death of Scalia, that is wrapped into all of this as well. So just wanted to footnote that in your own mind. And I'm not sure whether you have any background knowledge or if you ever looked into that. But there's a huge playing field out there. There are so many things going on. This information that you brought forward tonight is crucial and needs more investigation. We cannot reach too many conclusions regarding Max Spears, but we certainly have ample evidence of other things that you mentioned during the evening. Yes. To do with the Presidio, to do with yourself being a whistleblower in that regard, and the military, things that are operational behind the scenes and also have to do with very real politics and decisions that are made. The death of Benghazi and the death of the ambassador, things behind the scenes to do with that as well. There's a great deal for us to discuss. So I'm going to welcome you back in the very near future, some weeks from now, whatever is comfortable for you. And thank you everyone for listening tonight. Any parting words, Douglas, before I do my closing here and bring the credits on the screen?
Just that I do hope people visit my website, it's dddietrich.com now. So once again, that's www.dddietrich.com. You will find my DVDs for sale there. One of them is Satan's Crusaders, which was brought up earlier. There are two other different presentations of Roswell and the Rising Sun. Each one of these presentations covers a vastly different array of materials concerning the enormous amount of historical context that tends to ultimately focus around that pivotal atrocity that was ultimately basically propagandized by no less than Michael Aquino and his co-religionists. So I'll be going into that again as well in depth live down in Tucson on November 11th. But if people want to prepare so that they can have some questions, either for the presentation or more appropriately the seminar the day after on Saturday, in which people will be allowed free in through the door. We won't be charging at the door for visitors at that point. I definitely recommend that getting these videos as soon as possible, or the electronic downloads thereof, which you can get fairly quickly through www.dddietrich.com. Then please, by all means, do so. So thank you for the opportunity to bring that to people's attention, Carrie, and thank you for being who you are, and thank you for what you do for all of us.
Oh, okay. And thank you so much for being who you are, and thank you for your being so completely, one of the best speakers, really the most eloquent, and going into detail on many areas, and that helps people to understand, to see things in context, and then to begin to, as I would say, always do their own investigation as well, decide what resonates, what does not, and continue on from there. So thank you again for being on the show.
Thank you, Mate.
Okay, so what we will do here is I'm going to hang up with Douglas, and then we will actually go. I just wanted to make a couple remarks before I go to my credits. I did just return from interviewing Mark Richards for the 5th time. It was extraordinary, I have to say, and I'm going to be working on getting that out as soon as I can. It took a tremendous amount of energy, as always. We only spent one night up in Northern California because the money that we were hoping would come in that would allow us to stay 2 nights didn't really materialize. And so I just want to say thank you to the people that did donate. If you are interested in donating to, in essence, help this work happen, it is much appreciated and always needed. It's very difficult to pay my server costs, my webmaster for doing his job, and my designer for doing his. All the banners you see are done by the designer, and any in-person interviews are conducted with the help of my designer cameraman, Neil. So, it is nice to be able to try to pay people. There are many things that we're involved in trying to do here, as well as I'm writing a book, as well as releasing very soon books of the Camelot transcripts. And all of this takes a tremendous amount of work and time and focus. And I do want to say that Mark Richards has said some things that are going to be quite interesting, maybe even earth-shaking to some people that will see and listen to what I have to say. Again, doing a sort of a total recall. I am only allowed a small pencil and some paper to take notes with, and taking notes with pencil is very difficult in and of itself. But it was a fabulous discussion, and we got in depth on several areas that are quite crucial and have everything to do with what's going on in the world scene today. So stay tuned for that. And thank you for supporting Project Camelot. Thank you for watching. I'll be back tomorrow night with a very interesting panel discussion, roundtable discussion called We the People, in which I will have Judge Anna Reitz, and I have a list of people that are going to be my guests. In fact, what I'll do here is just put this on the screen so that people can see, because we did have a banner that is is available. Hold on one second here. Yeah, there it is. Okay. And this is going to have Russell J. Gould, who is said to be the postmaster. Scott Bennett will join us, hopefully, and Robert Horton, who is a very interesting I guess he's called a psychological military officer who was, has to do with psychological warfare. I think that was his background. And of course, many people have heard of Judge Anna von Reitz. We had to postpone last week because she lives in Alaska and they were having some terrible weather that would have interfered with our connection on Skype. So that's happening tomorrow night at 7 p.m. It will be quite a wild trip, I can say, because we'll be discussing really what is keeping America together and what the laws, et cetera, as many people will know. The background there. I do have a page on my website if you want to read more about it. I did put some information from Anna von Reitz as well as from Robert Horton about the secret space program and his take on things. And he's somebody who has come forward and done a great deal of investigation. He has a PDF ebook that I did make available to people at one point, and we'll see if we can get it out there again. So that's tomorrow night. On Wednesday night, actually, I have Mary Rodwell. So she is going to be my guest. She's in Australia, and as many people will know, she deals with children who are contactees and has written several books. I believe she has a new book out, and we're going to be talking about that new book. So this is a packed week. I also want to announce that I am going to Sedona next weekend, and I will be trying to put a speaking engagement together. It's very short notice, I realize, but this is how it happened. We have an opportunity to stay very cheaply in Sedona. I love to go to Sedona when the opportunity presents itself. I did live there for close to a year at one point, and love to visit the vortexes and just love that environment. So I will be there this weekend. I will try to put an event together for Saturday, either day or night. We have someone working on this, but if you live in Sedona or near that area and want to help with putting an event together for me, I am willing to come and speak, and I can talk about the Mark Richards revelations that recently I got, and as well as anything else you'd like to hear about, and can do my presentations as normal. So that's a possibility. It is last minute, as I said. We'll try to pull it together. I'll announce it on my website, of course, projectcamelotportal.com, if I'm able to manage this. And if not, and you just are in Sedona and want to say hello, go ahead and, send that message to me, and I'll try to arrange some small meeting place. I understand there's a cafe up above Airport Vortex that a lot of people do impromptu speaking engagements at. Maybe we could do something there if nothing else works out. So thank you for listening and watching. And this has been an excellent program covering these very important topics. And I hope people will take this information seriously and do further investigation. So thank you again, and have a good night. Bye-bye.